Henry Kissinger World Order. Reflections on the Character of Nations and the Course of History. Chapter 4. The United States and Iran, Approaches to Order. 1. The Tradition of Iranian Statecraft. 2. The Khomeini Revolution. 3. Nuclear proliferation and Iran. 4. Vision and Reality. Chapter 4. The United States and Iran, Approaches to Order. In the Ayatollah Khomeini Revolution, the Middle East regional order was turned upside down. Of all the countries of the region, Iran has perhaps the most coherent sense of nationhood and the most elaborated tradition of national interest-based statecraft. At the same time, Iran's leaders have traditionally reached far beyond the modern borders of Iran and have rarely had occasion to adhere to Westphalian concepts of statehood and sovereign equality. Iran's founding tradition was that of the Persian Empire, which, in a series of incarnations from the 7th century BC to the 7th century AD, established its rule across much of the contemporary Middle East and portions of Central Asia, Southwest Asia, and North Africa. With resplendent art and culture, a sophisticated bureaucracy experienced in administering far-flung provinces, and a vast multi-ethnic military steeled by successful campaigns in every direction, Persia saw itself as far more than one society among many. The Persian ideal of monarchy elevated its sovereign to quasi-divine status as a magnanimous overlord of peoples, the king of kings, dispensing justice and decreeing tolerance in exchange for peaceful political submission. The Persian imperial project, like classical China's, represented a form of world ordering in which cultural and political achievements and psychological assurance played as great a role as traditional military conquests. The 5th century BC Greek historian Herodotus described the self-confidence of a people that had absorbed the finest of all foreign customs, Median dress, Egyptian armor, and now regarded itself as the center of human achievement. Most of all they hold in honor themselves, then those who dwell next to themselves, and then those next to them, and so on, so that there is a progression in honor in relation to the distance. They hold least in honor those whose habitation is furthest from their own. This is because they think themselves to be the best of mankind in everything and that others have a hold on virtue. In proportion to their nearness, those that live furthest away are the most base. Roughly 2,500 years later this sense of serene self-confidence had endured, as manifested in the text of an 1850 trade agreement between the United States and the Safavid dynasty, which governed a curtailed but still expansive version of the Persian Empire consisting of Iran, and significant portions of present-day Afghanistan, Iraq, Kuwait, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Turkey, and Turkmenistan. Even after the recent loss of Armenia, Azerbaijan, Dagestan, and eastern Georgia in 2 wars with the expanding Russian Empire, the Shah projected the assurance of the heir of Xerxes and Cyrus, the President of the United States of North America, and His Majesty as exalted as the planet Saturn, the sovereign to whom the sun serves as a standard, whose splendor and magnificence are equal to that of the skies, the sublime sovereign, the monarch whose armies are as numerous as the stars, whose greatness calls to mind that of Jamshid, whose magnificence equals that of Darius, the heir of the crown and throne of the Kayanians, the sublime emperor of all Persia, being both equally and sincerely desirous of establishing relations of friendship between the two governments, which they wish to strengthen by a treaty of friendship and commerce, reciprocally advantageous and useful to the citizens and subjects of the two high contracting parties, have for this purpose named for their plenipotentiaries. At the intersection of East and West and administering provinces and dependencies, stretching at their widest extent from modern-day Libya to Kyrgyzstan and India, Persia was either the starting point or the eventual target of nearly every major conqueror on the Eurasian landmass from antiquity to the Cold War. Through all these upheavals, Persia, like China under roughly comparable circumstances, retained its distinct sense of identity. Expanding across vastly diverse cultures and regions, the Persian Empire adopted and synthesized their achievements into its own distinct concept of order. Submerged in waves of conquest by Alexander the Great, the early Islamic armies, and later the Mongols, shocks that all but erased the historical memory and political autonomy of other peoples, Persia retained its confidence in its cultural superiority. It bowed to its conquerors as a temporary concession but retained its independence through its worldview, charting great interior spaces in poetry and mysticism and revering its connection with the heroic ancient rulers recounted in its epic Book of Kings. Meanwhile, Persia distilled its experience managing all manner of territories and political challenges into a sophisticated canon of diplomacy, placing a premium on endurance, shrewd analysis of geopolitical realities, and the psychological manipulation of adversaries. This sense of distinctness and adroit maneuver endured in the Islamic era, when Persia adopted the religion of its Arab conquerors but, alone among the first wave of conquered peoples, insisted on retaining its language and infusing the new order with the cultural legacies of the empire that Islam had just overthrown. Eventually, Persia became the demographic and cultural center of Shurism, first as a dissenting tradition under Arab rule, later as the state religion starting in the 16th century, adopted partly as a way to distinguish itself from and defy the growing Ottoman Empire at its borders, which was Sunni. In contrast to the majority Sunni interpretation, this branch of Islam stressed the mystical and ineffable qualities of religious truth and authorized prudential dissimulation in the service of the interests of the faithful. In its culture, religion, and geopolitical outlook, Iran, as it called itself officially after 1935, had preserved the distinctiveness of its tradition and the special character of its regional role. The Khomeini Revolution. The revolution against Iran's 20th-century Shah Reza Pahlavi had begun, or at least had been portrayed to the West, as an anti-monarchical movement demanding democracy and economic redistribution. Many of its grievances were real, caused by the dislocations imposed by the Shah's modernization programs and the heavy-handed and arbitrary tactics with which the government attempted to control dissent. But when, in 1979, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini returned from exile in Paris and Iraq to claim the role of the revolution's supreme leader, he did so not on behalf of social programs or of democratic governance, but in the name of an assault against the entire regional order and indeed the institutional arrangements of modernity. The doctrine that took root in Iran under Khomeini was unlike anything that had been practiced in the West since the religious wars of the pre-Westphalian era. It conceived of the state not as a legitimate entity in its own right but as a weapon of convenience in a broader religious struggle. The 20th-century map of the Middle East, Khomeini announced, was a false and un-Islamic creation of imperialists and tyrannical self-seeking rulers who had separated the various segments of the Islamic Ummah community from each other and artificially created separate nations. All contemporary political institutions in the Middle East and beyond were illegitimate because they do not base themselves on divine law. Modern international relations based on procedural Westphalian principles rested on a false foundation because the relations between nations should be based on spiritual grounds and not on principles of national interest. In Khomeini's view, paralleling that of Qutb, an ideologically expansionist reading of the Quran pointed the way from these blasphemies and toward the creation of a genuinely legitimate world order. The first step would be the overthrow of all the governments in the Muslim world and their replacement by an Islamic government. Traditional national loyalties would be overridden because it is the duty of all of us to overthrow the Taghut, i.e., the illegitimate political powers that now rule the entire Islamic world. The founding of a truly Islamic political system in Iran would mark, as Khomeini declared upon the founding of the Islamic Republic of Iran on April 1, 1979, the first day of God's government. This entity would not be comparable to any other modern state. As Mehdi Bazargan, Khomeini's first appointee for the post of Prime Minister, told the New York Times, what was wanted was a government of the type seen during the 10 years of the rule of the Prophet Muhammad and the 5 years under his son-in-law, Ali, the first Shiite Imam. When government is conceived of as divine, dissent will be treated as blasphemy, not political opposition. Under Khomeini, the Islamic Republic carried out those principles, beginning with a wave of trials and executions, and a systematic repression of minority faiths far exceeding what had occurred under the Shah's authoritarian regime. Amidst these upheavals, a new paradox took shape, in the form of a dualistic challenge to international order. With Iran's revolution, an Islamist movement dedicated to overthrowing the Westphalian system gained control over a modern state and asserted its Westphalian rights and privileges, taking up its seat at the United Nations, conducting its trade, and operating its diplomatic apparatus. Iran's clerical regime thus placed itself at the intersection of two world orders, arrogating the formal protections of the Westphalian system even while repeatedly proclaiming that it did not believe in it, would not be bound by it, and intended ultimately to replace it. This duality has been ingrained in Iran's governing doctrine. Iran styles itself as the Islamic Republic, implying an entity whose authority transcends territorial demarcations, and the Ayatollah heading the Iranian power structure, first Khomeini, then his successor, Ali Khamenei, is conceived of not simply as an Iranian political figure but as a global authority, the supreme leader of the Islamic Revolution, and the leader of the Islamic Ummah and oppressed people. The Islamic Republic announced itself on the world stage with a massive violation of a core principle of the Westphalian international system, diplomatic immunity, by storming the American embassy in Tehran and holding its staff hostage for 444 days, an act affirmed by the current Iranian government, which in 2014 appointed the hostage-taker's translator to serve as its ambassador at the United Nations. In a similar spirit, in 1989, Ayatollah Khomeini claimed global juridical authority in issuing a fatwa, religious proscription, pronouncing a death sentence on Salman Rushdie, a British citizen of Indian Muslim descent, for his publication of a book in Britain and the United States deemed offensive to Muslims. Even while simultaneously conducting normal diplomatic relations with the countries whose territory these groups have in part arrogated, Iran in its Islamist aspect has supported organizations such as Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Mahdi Army in Iraq, non-state militias challenging established authorities and employing terror attacks as part of their strategy. Tehran's imperative of Islamic revolution has been interpreted to permit cooperation across the Sunni-Shia divide, to advance broader anti-Western interests, including Iran's arming of the Sunni jihadist group Hamas against Israel and, according to some reports, the Taliban in Afghanistan. The report of the 9/11 Commission and investigations of a 2013 terrorist plot in Canada suggested that al-Qaeda operatives had found scope to operate from Iran as well. On the subject of the need to overthrow the existing world order, Islamists on both sides, Sunni and Shia, have been in general agreement. However intense the Sunni-Shia doctrinal divide erupting across the Middle East in the early 21st century, Sayyid Qutb's views were essentially identical to those put forward by Iran's political ayatollahs. Qutb's premise that Islam would reorder and eventually dominate the world struck a chord with the men who recast Iran into the fount of religious revolution. Qutb's works circulate widely in Iran, some personally translated by Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. As Khamenei wrote in his 1967 introduction to Qutb's work, The Future of This Religion, this lofty and great author has tried in the course of the chapters of this book to first introduce the essence of the faith as it is and then, after showing that it is a program of living, to confirm, with his eloquent words and his particular world outlook, that ultimately world government shall be in the hands of our school and the future belongs to Islam. For Iran, representing the minority Shia branch of this endeavor, victory could be envisioned through the sublimation of doctrinal differences for shared aims. Toward this end, the Iranian constitution proclaims the goal of the unification of all Muslims as a national obligation. In accordance with the sacred verse of the Quran, "This your community is a single community, and I am your Lord, so worship me." 21 hours 92 minutes, all Muslims form a single nation, and the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran has the duty of formulating its general policies, with a view to cultivating the friendship and unity of all Muslim peoples, and it must constantly strive to bring about the political, economic, and cultural unity of the Islamic world. The emphasis would be not on theological disputes but on ideological conquest. As Khomeini elaborated, we must strive to export our revolution throughout the world, and must abandon all idea of not doing so, for not only does Islam refuse to recognize any difference between Muslim countries, it is the champion of all oppressed people. This would require an epic struggle against America, the global plunderer, and the communist materialist societies of Russia and Asia, as well as Zionism and Israel. Khomeini and his fellow Shia revolutionaries have differed from Sunni Islamists, however, and this is the essence of their fratricidal rivalry, in proclaiming that global upheaval would be capped with the coming of the Mahdi, who would return from occultation, being present though not visible, to assume the sovereign powers that the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic temporarily exercises in the Mahdi's place. Iranian then-President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad considered this principle sufficiently settled to put it before the United Nations, in an address on September 27, 2007. Without any doubt, the promised one, who is the ultimate savior, will come in the company of all believers, justice seekers and benefactors. He will establish a bright future and fill the world with justice and beauty. This is the promise of God, therefore it will be fulfilled. The peace envisaged by such a concept has as its prerequisite, as President Ahmadinejad wrote to President George W. Bush in 2006, a global submission to correct religious doctrine. Ahmadinejad's letter, widely interpreted in the West as an overture to negotiations, concluded with, "V'salam ala man ataba al-hoda," a phrase left untranslated in the version released to the public, "Peace only unto those who follow the true path." This was the identical admonition sent in the 7th century by the Prophet Muhammad to the emperors of Byzantium and Persia, soon to be attacked by the Islamic Holy War. For decades, Western observers have sought to pinpoint the root causes of such sentiments, convincing themselves that the more extreme statements are partly metaphorical and that a renunciation of policy, or of past Western conduct, such as American and British interference in Iranian domestic politics in the 1950s, might open the door to reconciliation. Yet revolutionary Islamism has not, up to now, manifested itself as a quest for international cooperation as the West understands the term, Nor is the Iranian clerical regime best interpreted as an aggrieved post-colonial independence movement waiting hopefully for demonstrations of American goodwill. Under the Ayatollah's concept of policy, the dispute with the West is not a matter of specific technical concessions or negotiating formulas, but a contest over the nature of world order. Even at a moment hailed in the West as auguring a new spirit of conciliation, after the completion of an interim agreement on Iran's nuclear program with the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, plus Germany, the Iranian Supreme Leader, Khomeini, declared in January 2014. By dressing up America's face, some individuals are trying to remove the ugliness, the violence and terror from this face and introduce America's government to the Iranian people as being affectionate and humanitarian. How can you change such an ugly and criminal face in front of the Iranian people with makeup? Iran will not violate what it agreed to. But the Americans are enemies of the Islamic Revolution, they are enemies of the Islamic Republic, they are enemies of this flag that you have raised. Or, as Khomeini put it somewhat more delicately in a speech to Iran's Guardian Council in September 2013, when a wrestler is wrestling with an opponent and in places shows flexibility for technical reasons, let him not forget who his opponent is. This state of affairs is not inevitably permanent. Among the states in the Middle East, Iran has perhaps the most coherent experience of national greatness and the longest and subtlest strategic tradition. It has preserved its essential culture for 3,000 years, sometimes as an expanding empire, for many centuries by the skilled manipulation of surrounding elements. Before the Ayatollah's revolution, the West's interaction with Iran had been cordial and cooperative on both sides, based on a perceived parallelism of national interests. Ironically, the Ayatollah's ascent to power was aided in its last stages by America's dissociation from the existing regime, on the mistaken belief that the looming change would accelerate the advent of democracy and strengthen U.S.-Iranian ties. The United States and the Western democracies should be open to fostering cooperative relations with Iran. What they must not do is base such a policy on projecting their own domestic experience as inevitably or automatically relevant to other societies, especially Iran's. They must allow for the possibility that the unchanged rhetoric of a generation is based on conviction rather than posturing, and will have had an impact on a significant number of the Iranian people. A change of tone is not necessarily a return to normalcy, especially where definitions of normalcy differ so fundamentally. It includes as well, and more likely, the possibility of a change in tactics to reach essentially unchanged goals. The United States should be open to a genuine reconciliation and make substantial efforts to facilitate it. Yet for such an effort to succeed, a clear sense of direction is essential, especially on the key issue of Iran's nuclear program. Nuclear proliferation and Iran. The future of Iranian-American relations will, at least in the short run, depend on the resolution of an ostensibly technical military issue. As these pages are being written, a potentially epochal shift in the region's military balance and its psychological equilibrium may be taking place. It has been ushered in by Iran's rapid progress toward the status of a nuclear weapons state amidst a negotiation between it and the permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany, the P5+1. Though couched in terms of technical and scientific capabilities, the issue is at heart about international order, about the ability of the international community to enforce its demands against sophisticated forms of rejection, the permeability of the global non-proliferation regime, and the prospects for a nuclear arms race in the world's most volatile region. The traditional balance of power emphasized military and industrial capacity. A change in it could be achieved only gradually or by conquest. The modern balance of power reflects the level of a society's scientific development and can be threatened dramatically by developments entirely within the territory of a state. No conquest could have increased Soviet military capacity as much as the breaking of the American nuclear monopoly in 1949. Similarly, the spread of deliverable nuclear weapons is bound to affect regional balances and the international order dramatically and to evoke a series of escalating counteractions. All Cold War American administrations were obliged to design their international strategies in the context of the awe-inspiring calculus of deterrence, the knowledge that nuclear war would involve casualties of a scale capable of threatening civilized life. They were haunted as well by the awareness that a demonstrated willingness to run the risk, at least up to a point, was essential if the world was not to be turned over to ruthless totalitarians. Deterrence held in the face of these parallel nightmares because only two nuclear superpowers existed. Each made comparable assessments of the perils to it from the use of nuclear weapons. But as nuclear weapons spread into more and more hands, the calculus of deterrence grows increasingly ephemeral and deterrence less and less reliable. In a widely proliferated world, it becomes ever more difficult to decide who is deterring whom and by what calculations. Even if it is assumed that proliferating nuclear countries make the same calculus of survival as the established ones with respect to initiating hostilities against each other. An extremely dubious judgment, new nuclear weapons states may undermine international order in several ways. The complexity of protecting nuclear arsenals and installations, and building the sophisticated warning systems possessed by the advanced nuclear states, may increase the risk of preemption by tilting incentives toward a surprise attack. They can also be used as a shield to deter retaliation against the militant actions of non-state groups. Nor could nuclear powers ignore nuclear war on their doorsteps. Finally, the experience with the private proliferation network of technically friendly Pakistan with North Korea, Libya, and Iran demonstrates the vast consequences to international order of the spread of nuclear weapons, even when the proliferating country does not meet the formal criteria of a rogue state. 3 hurdles have to be overcome in acquiring a deployable nuclear weapons capability: the acquisition of delivery systems, the production of fissile material, and the building of warheads. For delivery systems, there exists a substantially open market in France, Russia, and to some extent China. It requires primarily financial resources. Iran has already acquired the nucleus of a delivery system and can add to it at its discretion. The knowledge of how to build warheads is not esoteric or difficult to discover, and their construction is relatively easy to hide. The best, perhaps the only, way to prevent the emergence of a nuclear weapons capability is to inhibit the development of a uranium enrichment process. The indispensable component for this process is the device of centrifuges, the machines that produce enriched uranium. Plutonium enrichment must also be prevented and is part of the same negotiation. The United States and the other permanent members of the UN Security Council have been negotiating for over 10 years, through 2 administrations of both parties, to prevent the emergence of such a capability in Iran. 6 UN Security Council resolutions since 2006 have insisted that Iran suspend its nuclear enrichment program. 3 American presidents of both parties, every permanent member of the UN Security Council, including China and Russia, plus Germany, and multiple International Atomic Energy Agency reports and resolutions have all declared an Iranian nuclear weapon unacceptable, and demanded an unconditional halt to Iranian nuclear enrichment. No option was to be off the table, in the words of at least 2 American presidents, in pursuit of that goal. The record shows steadily advancing Iranian nuclear capabilities taking place while the Western position has been progressively softened. As Iran has ignored UN resolutions and built centrifuges, the West has put forward a series of proposals of increasing permissiveness, from insisting that Iran terminate its uranium enrichment permanently, 2004, to allowing that Iran might continue some enrichment at low, enriched uranium, LEU, levels, less than 20%, 2005, to proposing that Iran ship the majority of its LEU out of the country so that France and Russia could turn it into fuel rods with 20% enriched uranium, 2009. To a proposal allowing Iran to keep enough of its own 20% enriched uranium to run a research reactor while suspending operations at its Fordow facility of centrifuges capable of making more, 2013. Fordow itself was once a secret site. When discovered, it became the subject of Western demands that it close entirely. Now Western proposals suggest that activity at it be suspended, with safeguards making it difficult to restart. When the P5+1 first formed in 2006 to coordinate the positions of the international community, its negotiators insisted that Iran halt fuel cycle activities before negotiations could proceed. In 2009, this condition was dropped. Faced with this record, Iran has had little incentive to treat any proposal as final. With subtlety and no little daring, it has at each stage cast itself as less interested in a solution than the world's combined major powers, and invited them to make new concessions. When the negotiations started in 2003, Iran had 130 centrifuges. At this writing, it has deployed approximately 19,000, though only half are in use. At the beginning of the negotiations, Iran was not able to produce any fissile material. In the November 2013 interim agreement, Iran acknowledged that it possessed 7 tons of low-grade enriched uranium that, with the numbers of centrifuges Iran possesses, can be transformed into weapons-grade material in a number of months, enough for 7 to 10 Hiroshima-type bombs. In the interim agreement, Iran promised to give up about half of its 20% enriched uranium, but through a circuitous route, it pledged to convert it into a form from which it can easily be reconverted to its original status, and it has retained the means to do so. In any event, with the number of centrifuges now in Iran's possession, the 20% stage is less significant because uranium enriched to 5%. The threshold claimed to be a negotiations achievement, can be enriched to weapons grade in a matter of months. The attitude of the negotiators of the two sides reflected different perceptions of world order. The Iranian negotiators conveyed to their opposite numbers that they would not be deterred from pursuing their course even at the risk of an attack on Iran's nuclear facilities. The Western negotiators were convinced, and, underscoring their commitment to peace and diplomacy, periodically referred to this conviction, that the consequences of a military attack on Iran dwarfed the risks of a growth in the Iranian nuclear capability. They were reinforced in their calculations by the mantra of professionals, that every deadlock needs to be broken by a new proposal, the responsibility for which they assumed. For the West, the central question was whether a diplomatic solution could be found or whether military measures would be necessary. In Iran, the nuclear issue was treated as one aspect of a general struggle over regional order and ideological supremacy, fought in a range of arenas and territories with methods spanning the spectrum of war and peace, military and paramilitary operations, diplomacy, formal negotiation, propaganda, political subversion, in fluid and mutually reinforcing combination. In this context, the quest for an agreement must contend with the prospect that Tehran will be at least exploring a strategy of relaxing tensions, just enough to break the sanctions regime but retaining a substantial nuclear infrastructure and a maximum freedom of action, to turn it into a weapons program later. The process resulted in the November 2013 interim agreement, in which Iran agreed to a qualified, temporary suspension of enrichment in return for a lifting of some of the international sanctions imposed on it, for its defiance of UN Security Council demands. But because Iranian enrichment was permitted to continue for the 6 months of the interim agreement, its continuation as well as the implementation of more comprehensive restrictions will merge with the deadline to complete the overall agreement. The practical consequence has been the de facto acceptance of an Iranian enrichment program, leaving unresolved, but only on the Western side, its scale. Negotiations for a permanent agreement are in process at this writing. While the terms, or whether any are achievable, are not yet known, it is clear that they will be, like so many issues in the Middle East, about red lines. Will the Western negotiators, operating via the P5+1, insist that the red line be at the enrichment capability, as the UN resolutions have insisted? This would be a formidable task. Iran would need to reduce its centrifuges to a level consistent with the plausible requirements of a civilian nuclear program, as well as destroy or mothball the remainder. Such an outcome, whose practical effect is the abandonment of a military nuclear program by Iran, would open the prospect of a fundamental change in the West's relationship with Iran, particularly if it was linked to a consensus that the two sides would work to curtail both the Sunni and Shia waves of militant extremism, now threatening the region. In view of the Iranian supreme leader's repeated declarations that Iran would give up no capability it already possesses, statements reiterated by a panoply of senior Iranian officials, the Iranian emphasis seems to have shifted to moving the red line to the production of warheads, or to curtailing its centrifuges to a level that still leaves a substantial margin for a military nuclear program. Under such a scheme, Iran would enshrine in an international agreement its supreme leader's alleged fatwa against building nuclear weapons, a ruling that has never been published or seen by anyone outside the Iranian power structure. It would pledge to the P5+1 not to build nuclear weapons, and grant inspection rights to observe compliance. The practical effect of such undertakings would depend on the amount of time it would take Iran to build a weapon after it abrogated, or broke such an agreement. In view of the fact that Iran managed to build 2 secret enrichment plants while under international inspection, this breakout estimate would have to consider the possibility of undisclosed violations. An agreement must not leave Iran as a virtual nuclear power, a country that can become a military nuclear power in a time frame shorter than any non-nuclear neighbor could match, or any nuclear power could reliably prevent. Iran has brought exceptional skill and consistency to bear on its proclaimed goal of undermining the Middle East state system, and ejecting Western influence from the region. Whether Iran were to build and test a nuclear weapon in the near term or merely retain the capability to do so within months of choosing to do so, the implications on regional and global order will be comparable. Even if Iran were to stop at a virtual nuclear weapons capability, it will be seen to have achieved this level in defiance of the most comprehensive international sanctions ever imposed on any country. The temptations of Iran's geostrategic rivals, such as Turkey, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, to develop or purchase their own nuclear programs to match the Iranian capability will become irresistible. The risk of an Israeli preemptive attack would rise significantly. As for Iran, Having withstood sanctions in developing a nuclear weapons capability, it will gain prestige, new powers of intimidation, and enhanced capacity to act with conventional weapons or non-nuclear forms of unconventional war. It has been argued that a new approach to U.S.-Iranian relations will develop out of the nuclear negotiations, which will compensate for the abandonment of historic Western positions. The example of America's relationship with China is often cited to this effect, because it moved from hostility to mutual acceptance and even cooperation in a relatively short period of time, in the 1970s. Iran may be prepared, it is sometimes said, to constrain the diplomatic use of its virtual nuclear military program in exchange for the goodwill and strategic cooperation of the United States. The comparison is not apartment. China was facing 42 Soviet divisions on its northern border, after a decade of escalating mutual hostility and Chinese internal turmoil. It had every reason to explore an alternative international system in which to anchor itself. No such incentive is self-evident in Iranian-Western relations. In the past decade, Iran has witnessed the removal of two of its most significant adversaries, the Taliban regime in Afghanistan and Saddam Hussein's Iraq, ironically by American action, and it has deepened its influence and its military role in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. Two of its principal competitors for regional influence, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, have been preoccupied by internal challenges even as Iran has moved swiftly, and apparently successfully, to crush its internal opposition following a 2009 pro-democracy uprising. Its leaders have largely been welcomed into international respectability without committing to any major substantive change in policy, and courted by Western companies for investment opportunities even while sanctions are still in place. Ironically, the rise of Sunni jihadism along Iran's frontiers may produce second thoughts in Iran. But it is equally plausible that Tehran regards the strategic landscape as shifting in its favor and its revolutionary course as being vindicated. Which option Iran chooses will be determined by its own calculations, not American preconceptions. Until this writing, Iran and the West have attached different meanings to the concept of negotiation. While American and European negotiators were speaking with cautious optimism about prospects for a nuclear agreement, and exercising utmost restraint in their public statements in hopes of fostering a favorable atmosphere, Ayatollah Khomeini described the nuclear talks as part of an eternal religious struggle in which negotiation was a form of combat, and compromise was forbidden. As late as May 2014, with 6 weeks remaining in the interim agreement period, the Iranian supreme leader was reported to have described the nuclear talks as follows. The reason for the emphasis placed on the continuation of combat is not because of the warmongering of the Islamic establishment. It is only rational that for crossing a region filled with pirates, one should fully equip themselves and be motivated and capable of defending themselves. Under such circumstances, we have no option but to continue combat and allow the idea of combat to rule all domestic and foreign affairs of the country. Those who seek to promote concession-making and surrendering to bullies and accuse the Islamic establishment of warmongering are indeed committing treason. All the officials in the country in the field of economy, science, culture, policy-making, lawmaking and foreign negotiations should be aware that they are fighting and are continuing the combat for the establishment and survival of the Islamic system. Jihad is never-ending because Satan and the Satanic Front will exist eternally. For nations, history plays the role that character confers on human beings. In Iran's proud and rich history, one can distinguish 3 different approaches to international order. There was the policy of the state preceding the Khomeini Revolution, vigilant in protecting its borders, respectful of other nations' sovereignties, willing to participate in alliances, in effect, pursuing its national interests by Westphalian principles. There is also the tradition of empire, which viewed Iran as the center of the civilized world, and which sought to eliminate the autonomy of its surrounding countries as far as its power could reach. Finally, there is the Iran of jihad described in the preceding pages. From which of these traditions does the changed comportment of some high-ranking Iranian officials draw its inspiration? If we assume a fundamental change, what brought it about? Is the conflict psychological or strategic? Will it be resolved by a change in attitude or a modification of policy? And if the latter, what is the modification that should be sought? Can the two countries' views of world order be reconciled? Or will the world have to wait until jihadist pressures fade, as they disappeared earlier in the Ottoman Empire as a result of a change in power dynamics and domestic priorities? On the answer to these questions depends the future of U.S. Iranian relations and perhaps the peace of the world. In principle, the United States should be prepared to reach a geopolitical understanding with Iran, on the basis of Westphalian principles of non-intervention, and develop a compatible concept of regional order. Until the Khomeini Revolution, Iran and the United States had been de facto allies based on a hard-nosed assessment of the national interest by American presidents, from both parties. Iranian and American national interests were treated by both sides as parallel. Both opposed the domination of the region by a superpower, which during that period was the Soviet Union. Both were prepared to rely on principles of respect for other sovereignties in their policy toward the region. Both favored the economic development of the region, even when it did not proceed on an adequately broad front. From the American point of view, there is every reason to re-establish such a relationship. The tension in Iranian-American relations has resulted from Tehran's adoption of jihadist principles and rhetoric together with direct assaults on American interests and views of international order. How Iran synthesizes its complex legacies will be driven in large part by internal dynamics. In a country of such cultural and political intricacy, these may be unpredictable to outside observers and not subject to direct influence by foreign threats or blandishments. But whatever face Iran presents to the outside world, it does not alter the reality that Iran needs to make a choice. It must decide whether it is a country or a cause. The United States should be open to a cooperative course and encourage it. Yet the ingenuity and determination of Western negotiators, while a necessary component of this evolution, will not be sufficient to secure it. Abandonment by Iran of support for such groups as Hezbollah would be an important and necessary step in re-establishing a constructive pattern of bilateral relations. The test will be whether Iran interprets the chaos along its frontiers as a threat or as an opportunity to fulfill millennial hopes. The United States needs to develop a strategic view of the process in which it is engaged. Administration spokesmen explaining the reduced American role in the Middle East have described a vision of an equilibrium of Sunni states, and perhaps Israel, balancing Iran. Even were such a constellation to come to pass, it could only be sustained by an active American foreign policy. For the balance of power is never static, its components are in constant flux. The United States would be needed as a balancer for the foreseeable future. The role of balancer is best carried out if America is closer to each of the contending forces than they are to each other, and does not let itself be lured into underwriting either side's strategy, particularly at the extremes. Pursuing its own strategic objectives, the United States can be a crucial factor, perhaps the crucial factor, in determining whether Iran pursues the path of revolutionary Islam or that of a great nation legitimately and importantly lodged in the Westphalian system of states. But America can fulfill that role only on the basis of involvement, not of withdrawal. Vision and reality. The issue of peace in the Middle East has, in recent years, focused on the highly technical subject of nuclear weapons in Iran. There is no shortcut around the imperative of preventing their appearance. But it is well to recall periods when other seemingly intractable crises in the Middle East were given a new dimension by fortitude and vision. Between 1967 and 1973, there had been 2 Arab-Israeli wars, 2 American military alerts, an invasion of Jordan by Syria, a massive American airlift into a war zone, multiple hijackings of airliners, and the breaking of diplomatic relations with the United States by most Arab countries. Yet it was followed by a peace process that yielded 3 Egyptian-Israeli agreements, culminating in a peace treaty in 1979, a disengagement agreement with Syria in 1974, which has lasted 4 decades, despite the Syrian civil war, the Madrid Conference in 1991, which restarted the peace process, the Oslo Agreement between the PLO and Israel in 1993, and a peace treaty between Jordan and Israel in 1994. These goals were reached because 3 conditions were met: an active American policy, the thwarting of designs seeking to establish a regional order by imposing universalist principles through violence, and the emergence of leaders with a vision of peace. 2 events in my experience symbolize that vision. In 1981, during his last visit to Washington, President Sadat invited me to come to Egypt the following spring for the celebration when the Sinai Peninsula would be returned to Egypt by Israel. Then he paused for a moment and said, "Don't come for the celebration, it would be too hurtful to Israel. Come 6 months later, and you and I will drive to the top of Mount Sinai together, where I plan to build a mosque, a church, and a synagogue, to symbolize the need for peace." Yitzhak Rabin, once chief of staff of the Israeli army, was prime minister during the first political agreement ever between Israel and Egypt in 1975, and then again when he and former defense minister, now foreign minister, Shimon Peres negotiated a peace agreement with Jordan in 1994. On the occasion of the Israeli-Jordanian peace agreement, in July 1994, Rabin spoke at a joint session of the U.S. Congress together with King Hussein of Jordan. "Today we are embarking on a battle which has no dead and no wounded, no blood and no anguish. This is the only battle which is a pleasure to wage, the battle of peace." In the Bible, our book of books, peace is mentioned in its various idioms, 237 times. In the Bible, from which we draw our values and our strength, in the book of Jeremiah, we find a lamentation for Rachel the matriarch. It reads, "Refrain your voice from weeping, and your eyes from tears, for their work shall be rewarded, says the Lord. I will not refrain from weeping for those who are gone." But on this summer day in Washington, far from home, we sense that our work will be rewarded, as the prophet foretold. Both Sadat and Rabin were assassinated. But their achievements and inspiration are inextinguishable. Once again, doctrines of violent intimidation challenged the hopes for world order. But when they are thwarted, and nothing less will do, there may come a moment similar to what led to the breakthroughs recounted here, when vision overcame reality. World Order by Henry Kissinger. Reflections on the Character of Nations and the Course of History. Chapter 5, The Multiplicity of Asia. A. Asia and Europe, Different Concepts of Balance of Power. B. Japan. C. India. D. What is an Asian regional order? Chapter 5. The multiplicity of Asia. Asia and Europe, different concepts of balance of power. The term Asia ascribes a deceptive coherence to a disparate region. Until the arrival of modern Western powers, no Asian language had a word for Asia. None of the peoples of what are now Asia's nearly 50 sovereign states conceived of themselves as inhabiting a single continent, or region requiring solidarity with all the others. As the East, it has never been clearly parallel to the West. There has been no common religion, not even one splintered into different branches as is Christianity in the West. Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, and Christianity all thrive in different parts of Asia. There is no memory of a common empire comparable to that of Rome. Across Northeast, East, Southeast, South, and Central Asia, prevailing major ethnic, linguistic, religious, social, and cultural differences have been deepened, often bitterly, by the wars of modern history. The political and economic map of Asia illustrates the region's complex tapestry. It comprises industrially and technologically advanced countries in Japan, the Republic of Korea, and Singapore, with economies and standards of living rivaling those of Europe, 3 countries of continental scale in China, India, and Russia, 2 large archipelagos, in addition to Japan, the Philippines and Indonesia, composed of thousands of islands and standing astride the main sea lanes, 3 ancient nations with populations approximating those of France or Italy in Thailand, Vietnam, and Myanmar, huge Australia and pastoral New Zealand, with largely European-descended populations, and North Korea, a Stalinist family dictatorship bereft of industry and technology except for a nuclear weapons program. A large Muslim majority population prevails across Central Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Malaysia, and Indonesia, and sizable Muslim minorities exist in India, China, Myanmar, Thailand, and the Philippines. The global order during the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century was predominantly European, designed to maintain a rough balance of power between the major European countries. Outside their own continent, the European states built colonies and justified their actions under various versions of their so-called civilizing mission. From the perspective of the 21st century, in which Asian nations are rising in wealth, power, and confidence, it may seem improbable that colonialism gained such force or that its institutions were treated as a normal mechanism of international life. Material factors alone cannot explain it. A sense of mission and intangible psychological momentum also played a role. The pamphlets and treatises of the colonial powers from the dawn of the 20th century reveal a remarkable arrogance, to the effect that they were entitled to shape a world order by their maxims. Accounts of China or India condescendingly defined a European mission to educate traditional cultures to higher levels of civilization. European administrators with relatively small staffs redrew the borders of ancient nations, oblivious that this might be an abnormal, unwelcome, or illegitimate development. At the dawn of what is now called the modern age in the 15th century, a confident, fractious, territorially divided West had set sail to reconnoiter the globe and to improve, exploit, and civilize the lands it came upon. It impressed upon the peoples it encountered views of religion, science, commerce, governance, and diplomacy shaped by the Western historical experience, which it took to be the capstone of human achievement. The West expanded with the familiar hallmarks of colonialism, avariciousness, cultural chauvinism, lust for glory. But it is also true that its better elements tried to lead a kind of global tutorial in an intellectual method. that encouraged skepticism and a body of political and diplomatic practices, ultimately including democracy. It all but ensured that, after long periods of subjugation, the colonized peoples would eventually demand, and achieve, self-determination. Even during their most brutal depredations, the expansionist powers put forth, especially in Britain, a vision that at some point conquered peoples would begin to participate in the fruits of a common global system. Finally recoiling from the sordid practice of slavery, the West produced what no other slaveholding civilization had: a global abolition movement based on a conviction of common humanity and the inherent dignity of the individual. Britain, rejecting its previous embrace of the despicable trade, took the lead in enforcing a new norm of human dignity, abolishing slavery in its empire and interdicting slave trading ships on the high seas. The distinctive combination of overbearing conduct, technological prowess, idealistic humanitarianism, and revolutionary intellectual ferment proved one of the shaping factors of the modern world. With the exception of Japan, Asia was a victim of the international order imposed by colonialism, not an actor in it. Thailand sustained its independence but, unlike Japan, was too weak to participate in the balance of power as a system of regional order. China's size prevented it from full colonization, but it lost control over key aspects of its domestic affairs. Until the end of World War II, most of Asia conducted its policies as an adjunct of European powers or, in the case of the Philippines, of the United States. The conditions for Westphalian-style diplomacy only began to emerge with the decolonization that followed the devastation of the European order by 2 world wars. The process of emancipation from the prevalent regional order was violent and bloody: the Chinese Civil War, 1927–49, the Korean War, 1950–53, a Sino-Soviet confrontation, roughly 1955–80, revolutionary guerrilla insurgencies all across Southeast Asia, the Vietnam War, 1961–75, 4 India-Pakistan Wars, 1947, 1965, 1971, and 1999, a Chinese-Indian War, 1962, a Chinese-Vietnamese War, 1979, and the depredations of the genocidal Khmer Rouge, 1975–79. After decades of war and revolutionary turmoil, Asia has transformed itself dramatically. The rise of the Asian tigers, evident from 1970, involving Hong Kong, the Republic of Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, and Thailand, brought prosperity and economic dynamism into view. Japan adopted democratic institutions and built an economy rivaling and in some cases surpassing those of Western nations. In 1979, China changed course and, under Deng Xiaoping, proclaimed a non-ideological foreign policy and a policy of economic reforms that, continued and accelerated under his successors, have had a profound transformative effect on China and the world. As these changes unfolded, national interest-based foreign policy premised on Westphalian principles seemed to have prevailed in Asia. Unlike in the Middle East, where almost all the states are threatened by militant challenges to their legitimacy, in Asia the state is treated as the basic unit of international and domestic politics. The various nations emerging from the colonial period generally affirmed one another's sovereignty, and committed to non-interference in one another's domestic affairs. They followed the norms of international organizations and built regional or interregional economic and social organizations. In this vein, a top Chinese military official, the Chinese People's Liberation Army Deputy Chief of General Staff Qi Jiangwo, wrote in a major January 2013 policy review that one of the primary challenges of the contemporary era is to uphold the basic principle of modern international relations firmly established in the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia, especially the principles of sovereignty and equality. Asia has emerged as among the Westphalian system's most significant legacies. Historic, and often historically antagonistic, peoples are organizing themselves as sovereign states and their states as regional groupings. In Asia, far more than in Europe, not to speak of the Middle East, the maxims of the Westphalian model of international order find their contemporary expression, including doctrines since questioned by many in the West as excessively focused on the national interest, or insufficiently protective of human rights. Sovereignty, in many cases wrought only recently from colonial rule, is treated as having an absolute character. The goal of state policy is not to transcend the national interest, as in the fashionable concepts in Europe or the United States, but to pursue it energetically and with conviction. Every government dismisses foreign criticism of its internal practices as a symptom of just, surmounted colonial tutelage. Thus, even when neighboring states' domestic actions are perceived as excesses, as they have been, for example, in Myanmar, they are treated as an occasion for quiet diplomatic intercession, not overt pressure, much less forcible intervention. At the same time, an element of implicit threat is ever present. China affirms explicitly, and all other key players implicitly, the option of military force in the pursuit of core national interests. Military budgets are rising. National rivalries, as in the South China Sea and Northeast Asian waters, have generally been conducted with the methods of 19th-century European diplomacy. Force has not been excluded, though its application has been restrained, if tenuously, as the years go by. Hierarchy, not sovereign equality, was the organizing principle of Asia's historical international systems. Power was demonstrated by the deference shown to a ruler and the structures of authority that recognized his overlordship, not the delineation of specific borders on a map. Empires spread their trade and their political writ, soliciting the alignment of smaller political units. For the peoples who existed at the intersection of two or more imperial orders, the path to independence was often to enroll as a nominal subordinate in more than one sphere, an art still remembered and practiced today in some quarters. In Asia's historical diplomatic systems, whether based on Chinese or Hindu models, monarchy was considered an expression of divinity or, at the very least, a kind of paternal authority. Tangible expressions of tribute were thought to be owed to superior countries by their inferiors. This theoretically left no room for ambiguity as to the nature of regional power relationships, leading to a series of rigid alignments. In practice, however, these principles were applied with remarkable creativity and fluidity. In Northeast Asia, the Ryukyu Kingdom for a time paid tribute to both Japan and China. In the northern hills of Burma, tribes secured a form of de facto autonomy by pledging their loyalty simultaneously to the Burmese royal court and the Chinese emperor, and generally not straining to follow the dictates of either. For centuries, Nepal skillfully balanced its diplomatic posture between the ruling dynasties in China and those in India, offering letters and gifts that were interpreted as tribute in China but recorded as evidence of equal exchanges in Nepal, then holding out a special tie with China as a guarantee of Nepal's independence vis-a-vis India. Thailand, eyed as a strategic target by expanding Western empires in the 19th century, avoided colonization altogether through an even more elaborate strategy of affirming cordial ties with all foreign powers at once, welcoming foreign advisors from multiple competing Western states into its court even while sending tribute missions to China, and retaining Hindu priests of Indian descent for the royal household. The intellectual suppleness and emotional forbearance demanded by this balancing strategy were all the more remarkable given that the Thai king was himself regarded as a divine figure. Any concept of a regional order was considered too inhibiting of the flexibility demanded from diplomacy. Against this backdrop of subtle and diverse legacies, the grid of Westphalian sovereign states on a map of Asia presents an oversimplified picture of regional realities. It cannot capture the diversity of aspirations that leaders bring to their tasks, or the combination of punctilious attention to hierarchy and protocol with adroit maneuver that characterizes much of Asian diplomacy. It is the fundamental framework of international life in Asia. But statehood there is also infused with a set of cultural legacies of a greater diversity and immediacy than perhaps any other region. This is underscored by the experiences of two of Asia's major nations, Japan and India. Japan. Of all of Asia's historical, political, and cultural entities, Japan reacted the earliest and by far the most decisively to the Western eruption across the world. Situated on an archipelago some 100 miles off the Asian mainland at the closest crossing, Japan long cultivated its traditions and distinctive culture in isolation. Possessed of ethnic and linguistic near homogeneity and an official ideology that stressed the Japanese people's divine ancestry, Japan turned conviction of its unique identity into a kind of near-religious commitment. This sense of distinctness gave it great flexibility in adjusting its policies to its conception of national strategic necessity. Within the space of little more than a century after 1868, Japan moved from total isolation to extensive borrowing from the apparently most modern states in the West, for the army from Germany, for parliamentary institutions, and for the navy from Britain. From audacious attempts at empire building to pacifism and thence to a re-emergence of a new kind of major power stance, from feudalism to varieties of Western authoritarianism and from that to embracing democracy, and in and out of world orders, first Western, then Asian, now global. Throughout, it was convinced that its national mission could not be diluted by adjusting to the techniques and institutions of other societies. It would only be enhanced by successful adaptation. Japan for centuries existed at the fringe of the Chinese world, borrowing heavily from Sinic religion and culture. But unlike most societies in the Chinese cultural sphere, it transformed the borrowed forms into Japanese patterns and never conflated them with a hierarchical obligation to China. Japan's resilient position was at times a source of consternation for the Chinese court. Other Asian peoples accepted the premises and protocol of the tribute system, a symbolic subordination to the Chinese emperor by which Chinese protocol ordered the universe, labeling their trade as tribute to gain access to Chinese markets. They respected, at least in their exchanges with the Chinese court, the Confucian concept of international order as a familial hierarchy with China as the patriarch. Japan was geographically close enough to understand this vocabulary intimately and generally made tacit allowance for the Chinese world order as a regional reality. In quest of trade or cultural exchange, Japanese missions followed etiquette close enough to established forms that Chinese officials could interpret it as evidence of Japan's aspiration to membership in a common hierarchy. Yet in a region carefully attuned to the gradations of status implied in minute protocol decisions, such as the single word used to refer to a ruler, the mode in which a formal letter was delivered, or the style of calendar date on a formal document, Japan consistently refused to take up a formal role in the Sinocentric tribute system. It hovered at the edge of a hierarchical Chinese world order, periodically insisting on its equality and, at some points, its own superiority. At the apex of Japan's society and its own view of world order stood the Japanese emperor, a figure conceived, like the Chinese emperor, as the son of heaven, an intermediary between the human and the divine. This title, insistently displayed on Japanese diplomatic dispatches to the Chinese court, was a direct challenge to the cosmology of the Chinese world order, which posited China's emperor as the single pinnacle of human hierarchy. In addition to this status, which carried a transcendent import above and beyond what would have been claimed by any Holy Roman Emperor in Europe, Japan's traditional political philosophy posited another distinction, that Japanese emperors were deities descended from the sun goddess, who gave birth to the first emperor and endowed his successors with an eternal right to rule. According to the 14th century records of the legitimate succession of the divine sovereigns, Japan is the divine country. The heavenly ancestor it was who first laid its foundations, and the sun goddess left her descendants to reign over it forever and ever. This is true only of our country, and nothing similar may be found in foreign lands. That is why it is called the divine country. Japan's insular position allowed it wide latitude about whether to participate in international affairs at all. For many centuries, it remained on the outer boundaries of Asian affairs, cultivating its military traditions through internal contests and admitting foreign trade and culture at its discretion. At the close of the 16th century, Japan attempted to recast its role with an abruptness and sweep of ambition that its neighbors at first dismissed as implausible. The result was one of Asia's major military conflicts, whose regional legacies remain the subject of vivid remembrance and dispute and whose lessons, if heeded, might have changed America's conduct in the 20th century Korean War. In 1590, the warrior Toyotomi Hideyoshi, having bested his rivals, unified Japan, and brought more than a century of civil conflict to a close, announced a grander vision: he would raise the world's largest army, march it up the Korean peninsula, conquer China, and subdue the world. He dispatched a letter to the Korean king announcing his intent to proceed to the country of the Great Ming and compel the people there to adopt our customs and manners, and inviting his assistance. After the king demurred and warned him against the endeavor, citing an inseparable relationship between the Middle Kingdom and our kingdom, and the Confucian principle that to invade another state is an act of which men of culture and intellectual attainments should feel ashamed, Hideyoshi launched an invasion of 160,000 men and roughly 700 ships. This massive force overwhelmed initial defenses and at first marched swiftly up the peninsula. Its progress slowed as Korea's Admiral Lee Sun-sin organized a determined naval resistance, harrying Hideyoshi's supply lines and deflecting the invading armies to battles along the coast. When Japanese forces reached Pyongyang, near the narrow northern neck of the peninsula, and now North Korea's capital, China intervened in force, unwilling to allow its tribute state to be overrun. A Chinese expeditionary army estimated between 40,000 and 100,000 strong crossed the Yalu River, and pushed Japanese forces back as far as Seoul. After 5 years of inconclusive negotiations and devastating combat, Hideyoshi died, the invasion force withdrew, and the status quo ante was restored. Those who argue that history never repeats itself should ponder the comparability of China's resistance to Hideyoshi's enterprise with that encountered by America in the Korean War nearly 400 years later. On the failure of this venture, Japan changed course, turning to ever-increasing seclusion. Under the locked country policy lasting over 2 centuries, Japan all but absented itself from participating in any world order. Comprehensive state-to-state relations on conditions of strict diplomatic equality existed only with Korea. Chinese traders were permitted to operate in select locations, though no official Sino-Japanese relations existed because no protocol could be worked out that satisfied both sides amor propre. Foreign trade with European countries was restricted to a few specified coastal cities. By 1673, all but the Dutch had been expelled, and they were confined to a single artificial island off the port of Nagasaki. By 1825, suspicion of the seafaring Western powers had become so great that Japan's ruling military authorities promulgated an edict to expel foreigners at all cost, declaring that any foreign vessel approaching Japanese shores was to be driven away unconditionally, by force if necessary. All this was, however, prelude to another dramatic shift, under which Japan ultimately vaulted itself into the global order, for 2 centuries largely Western, and became a modern great power on Westphalian principles. The decisive catalyst came when Japan was confronted, in 1853, by 4 American naval vessels dispatched from Norfolk, Virginia, on an expedition to flout deliberately the seclusion edicts by entering Tokyo Bay. Their commanding officer, Commodore Matthew Perry, bore a letter from President Millard Fillmore to the Emperor of Japan, which he insisted on delivering directly to imperial representatives in the Japanese capital, a breach of 2 centuries of Japanese law and diplomatic protocol. Japan, which held foreign trade in as little esteem as China, cannot have been particularly reassured by the president's letter, which informed the emperor, whom Fillmore addressed as his great and good friend, that the American people think that if your imperial majesty were so far to change the ancient laws as to allow a free trade between the 2 countries, it would be extremely beneficial to both. Fillmore clothed the de facto ultimatum into a classically American pragmatic proposal to the effect that the established seclusion laws, heretofore described as immutable, might be loosened on a trial basis. If your imperial majesty is not satisfied that it would be safe altogether to abrogate the ancient laws which forbid foreign trade, they might be suspended for 5 or 10 years, so as to try the experiment. If it does not prove as beneficial as was hoped, the ancient laws can be restored. The United States often limit their treaties with foreign states to a few years, and then renew them or not, as they please. The Japanese recipients of the message recognized it as a challenge to their concept of political and international order. Yet they reacted with the reserved composure of a society that had experienced and studied the transitoriness of human endeavors for centuries while retaining its essential nature. Surveying Perry's far superior firepower, Japanese cannons and firearms had barely advanced in 2 centuries, while Perry's vessels were equipped with state-of-the-art naval gunnery capable, as he demonstrated along the Japanese coast, of firing explosive shells. Japan's leaders concluded that direct resistance to the black ships would be futile. They relied on the cohesion of their society to absorb the shock and maintain their independence by that cohesion. They prepared an exquisitely courteous reply explaining that although the changes America sought were most positively forbidden by the laws of our imperial ancestors, nonetheless, for us to continue attached to ancient laws seems to misunderstand the spirit of the age. Allowing that, we are governed now by imperative necessity, Japanese representatives assured Perry that they were prepared to satisfy nearly all of the American demands, including constructing a new harbor capable of accommodating American ships. Japan drew from the Western challenge a conclusion contrary to that of China. After the appearance of a British envoy in 1793, discussed in the next chapter, China reaffirmed its traditional stance of dismissing the intruder with aloof indifference. While cultivating China's distinctive virtues, confident that the vast extent of its population and territory and the refinement of its culture would in the end prevail, Japan set out, with studious attention to detail and subtle analysis of the balance of material and psychological forces, to enter the international order based on Western concepts of sovereignty, free trade, international law, technology, and military power, albeit for the purpose of expelling the foreign domination. After a new faction came to power in 1868 promising to revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, they announced that they would do so by mastering the barbarians' concepts and technologies and joining the Westphalian world order as an equal member. The new Meiji emperor's coronation was marked with the charter oath signed by the nobility, promising a sweeping program of reform, which included provisions that all social classes should be encouraged to participate. It provided for deliberative assemblies in all provinces, an affirmation of due process, and a commitment to fulfill the aspirations of the population. It relied on the national consensus, which has been one of the principal strengths, perhaps the most distinctive feature, of Japanese society. 1. By this oath, we set up as our aim the establishment of the national wealth on a broad basis and the framing of a constitution and laws. 2. Deliberative assemblies shall be widely established and all matters decided by open discussion. 3. All classes, high and low, shall be united in vigorously carrying out the administration of affairs of state. 4. The common people, no less than the civil and military officials, shall all be allowed to pursue their own calling so that there may be no discontent. 5. Evil customs of the past shall be broken off and everything based upon the just laws of nature. 6. Knowledge shall be sought throughout the world so as to strengthen the foundation of imperial rule. Japan would henceforth embark on the systematic construction of railways, modern industry, an export-oriented economy, and a modern military. Amidst all these transformations, the uniqueness of Japanese culture and society would preserve Japanese identity. The results of this dramatic change, of course, would, within a few decades, vault Japan into the ranks of global powers. In 1886, after a brawl between Chinese sailors and Nagasaki police, a modern German-built Chinese warship sailed toward Japan, compelling a resolution. By the next decade, intensive naval construction and training had given Japan the upper hand. When an 1894 dispute over relative Japanese and Chinese influence in Korea culminated in war, Japan prevailed decisively. The peace terms included an end of Chinese suzerainty over Korea, giving way to new contests between Japan and Russia, and the cession of Taiwan, which Japan governed as a colony. Japan's reforms were pursued with such vigor that the Western powers were soon obliged to abandon the model of extraterritoriality, their right to try their own citizens in Japan by their own, not local, laws, which they had first applied in China. In a landmark trade treaty, Britain, the preeminent Western power, committed British subjects in Japan to abide by Japanese jurisdiction. In 1902, the British treaty was transformed into a military alliance, the first formal strategic alignment between an Asian and a Western power. Britain sought the alliance to balance Russian pressures on India. Japan's goal was to defeat Russian aspirations to dominate Korea and Manchuria and to establish its own freedom of maneuver for later designs there. 3 years later, Japan stunned the world by defeating the Russian Empire in a war, the first defeat of a Western country by an Asian country in the modern period. In World War I, Japan joined the Entente powers and seized German bases in China and the South Pacific. Japan had arrived as the first non-Western great power in the contemporary age, accepted as a military, economic, and diplomatic equal by the countries that had heretofore shaped the international order. There was one important difference. On the Japanese side, The alliances with Western countries were not based on common strategic objectives but to expel its European allies from Asia. After the exhaustion of Europe in World War I, Japan's leaders concluded that a world beset by conflict, financial crisis, and American isolationism favored imperial expansion aimed at imposing hegemony on Asia. Imperial Japan detached Manchuria from China in 1931 and established it as a Japanese satellite state, under the exiled Chinese emperor. In 1937, Japan declared war on China in order to subjugate additional Chinese territory. In the name of a new order in Asia, and then an East Asian co-prosperity sphere, Japan strove to organize its own anti-Westphalian sphere of influence, a bloc of Asian nations led by the Japanese and free of Western powers, arranged hierarchically to thereby enable all nations to find each its proper place in the world. In this new order, other Asian states' sovereignty would be elided into a form of Japanese tutelage. The members of the established international order were too exhausted by World War I and too preoccupied with the mounting European crisis to resist. Only one Western country remained in the way of this design, the United States, the country that had forcibly opened up Japan less than a century earlier. As though history contained a narrative, the first bombs of a war between the two countries fell on American territory in 1941, when the Japanese launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. American mobilization in the Pacific eventually culminated in the use of 2 nuclear weapons, the sole military use of these weapons to date, bringing about Japan's unconditional surrender. Japan adjusted to the debacle by methods similar to its response to Commodore Perry, resilience sustained by an indomitable national spirit based on a distinctive national culture. To restore the Japanese nation, Japan's post-war leaders, almost all of whom had been in the public service in the 1930s and 1940s, portrayed surrender as adaptation to American priorities. Indeed, Japan used the authority of the American occupation regime to modernize more fully, and to recover more rapidly than it could have by purely national efforts. It renounced war as an instrument of national policy, affirmed principles of constitutional democracy, and re-entered the international state system as an American ally, though a low-key one more visibly concerned with economic revival than with participation in grand strategy. For nearly 7 decades, this new orientation has proved an important anchor of Asian stability and global peace and prosperity. Japan's post-war posture was frequently described as a new pacifism. In fact, it was considerably more complex. Above all, it reflected an acquiescence in American predominance and an assessment of the strategic landscape, and the imperatives of Japan's survival and long-term success. Japan's post-war governing class accepted the constitution drafted by American occupying authorities, with its stringent prohibitions on military action, as a necessity of their immediate circumstances. They avowed its liberal democratic orientation as their own. They affirmed principles of democracy and international community akin to those embraced in Western capitals. At the same time, Japan's leaders adapted their country's unique demilitarized role to Japanese long-term strategic purposes. They transformed the pacifist aspects of the post-war order from a prohibition against military action to an imperative to focus on other key elements of national strategy, including economic revitalization. American forces were invited to remain deployed in Japan in substantial numbers, and the defense commitment was solidified into a mutual security treaty, deterring potentially antagonistic powers, including a Soviet Union expanding its Pacific presence, from viewing Japan as a target for strategic action. Having established the framework of the relationship, Japan's Cold War leaders proceeded to reinforce their country's capacities by developing an independent military capability. The effect of the first stage of Japan's post-war evolution was to take its strategic orientation out of Cold War contests, freeing it to focus on a transformative program of economic development. Japan placed itself legally in the camp of the developed democracies but, citing its pacifist orientation and commitment to world community, declined to join the ideological struggles of the age. The result of this subtle strategy was a period of concerted economic growth, paralleled only by that following the 1868 Meiji Revolution. Within 2 decades of its wartime devastation, Japan had rebuilt itself as a major global economic power. The Japanese miracle was soon after invoked as a potential challenge to American economic preeminence, though it began to level off in the last decade of the 20th century. The social cohesion and sense of national commitment that enabled this remarkable transformation has been called forth in response to contemporary challenges. It enabled the Japanese people to respond to a devastating 2011 earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear crisis in Japan's northeast, by World Bank estimates, the costliest natural disaster in world history, with an astonishing display of mutual assistance and national solidarity. Financial and demographic challenges have been the subject of searching internal assessment and, in some aspects, equally bold measures. In each endeavor, Japan has called forth its resources with its traditional confidence that its national essence and culture could be maintained through almost any adjustments. Dramatic changes in the balance of power will inevitably be translated by Japan's establishment into a new adaptation of Japanese foreign policy. The return of strong national leadership under Prime Minister Shinzo Abe gives Tokyo new latitude to act on its assessments. A December 2013 Japanese government white paper concluded that, as Japan's security environment becomes ever more severe, it has become indispensable for Japan to make more proactive efforts in line with the principle of international cooperation, including strengthening Japan's capacity to deter and, if needed, defeat threats. Surveying a changing Asian landscape, Japan increasingly articulates a desire to become a normal country, with a military not constitutionally barred from war and an active alliance policy. The issue for Asian regional order will be the definition of normality. As at other pivotal moments in its history, Japan is moving toward a redefinition of its broader role in international order, sure to have far-reaching consequences in its region and beyond. Searching for a new role, it will assess once again, carefully, unsentimentally, and unobtrusively, the balance of material and psychological forces in light of the rise of China, Korean developments, and their impact on Japan's security. It will examine the utility and record of the American alliance and its considerable success in serving wide-ranging mutual interests. It will also consider America's withdrawal from 3 military conflicts. Japan will conduct this analysis in terms of 3 broad options: continued emphasis on the American alliance, adaptation to China's rise, and reliance on an increasingly national foreign policy. Which of them will emerge as dominant, or whether the choice is for a mix of them, depends on Japan's calculations of the global balance of power, not formal American assurances, and how it perceives underlying trends. Should Japan perceive a new configuration of power unfolding in its region or the world, it will base its security on its judgment of reality, not on traditional alignments. The outcome therefore depends on how credible the Japanese establishment judges American policy in Asia to be, and how they assess the overall balance of forces. The long-term direction of U.S. foreign policy is as much at issue as Japan's analysis. India. In Japan, the impetus of Western intrusion changed the course of a historic nation. In India, it reshaped a great civilization into a modern state. India has long developed its qualities at the intersection of world orders, shaping and being shaped by their rhythms. It has been defined less by its political borders than by a shared spectrum of cultural traditions. No mythic founder has been credited with promulgating the Hindu tradition, India's majority faith and the wellspring of several others. History has traced its evolution, dimly and incompletely, through a synthesis of traditional hymns, legends, and rituals from cultures along the Indus and Ganges rivers and plateaus and uplands north and west. In the Hindu tradition, however, these specific forms were the diverse articulations of underlying principles that predated any written text. In its diversity and resistance to definition, encompassing distinct gods and philosophical traditions, the analogues of which would likely have been defined as separate religions in Europe, Hinduism was said to approximate and prove the ultimate oneness of manifold creation, reflecting the long and diversified history of man's quest for reality, at once all-embracing and infinite. When united, as during the 4th through 2nd centuries BC and the 4th through 7th centuries AD, India generated currents of vast cultural influence. Buddhism spread from India to Burma, Ceylon, China, and Indonesia, and Hindu art and statecraft influenced Thailand, Indochina, and beyond. When divided, as it often was, into competing kingdoms, India was a lure for invaders, traders, and spiritual seekers, some fulfilling multiple roles at once, such as the Portuguese, who arrived in 1498, in search of Christians and spices, whose depredations it endured and whose cultures it eventually absorbed and mixed with its own. China, until the modern age, imposed its own matrix of customs and culture on invaders so successfully that they grew indistinguishable from the Chinese people. By contrast, India transcended foreigners not by converting them to Indian religion or culture but by treating their ambitions with supreme equanimity. It integrated their achievements and their diverse doctrines into the fabric of Indian life, without ever professing to be especially awed by any of them. Invaders might raise extraordinary monuments to their own importance, as if to reassure themselves of their greatness in the face of so much aloofness, but the Indian peoples endured by a core culture defiantly impervious to alien influence. India's foundational religions are inspired not by prophetic visions of messianic fulfillment, rather, they bear witness to the fragility of human existence. They offer not personal salvation but the solace of an inextricable destiny. World order in Hindu cosmology was governed by immutable cycles of an almost inconceivably vast scale, millions of years long. Kingdoms would fall, and the universe would be destroyed, but it would be recreated, and new kingdoms would rise again. When each wave of invaders arrived, Persians in the 6th century BC, Alexander and his Bactrian Greeks in the 4th century BC, Arabs in the 8th century, Turks and Afghans in the 11th and 12th centuries, Mongols in the 13th and 14th centuries, Mughals in the 16th century, and various European nations following shortly after, they were fitted into this timeless matrix. Their efforts might disrupt, but measured against the perspective of the infinite, they were irrelevant. The true nature of human experience was known only to those who endured and transcended these temporal upheavals. The Hindu classic the Bhagavad Gita framed these spirited tests in terms of the relationship between morality and power. The work, an episode within the Mahabharata, the ancient Sanskrit epic poem sometimes likened in its influence to the Bible or the Homeric epics, takes the form of a dialogue between the warrior prince Arjuna and his charioteer, a manifestation of the god Lord Krishna. Arjuna, overwhelmed by sorrow, on the eve of battle at the horrors he is about to unleash, wonders what can justify the terrible consequences of war. This is the wrong question. Krishna rejoins. Because life is eternal and cyclical and the essence of the universe is indestructible, the wise grieve neither for the living nor for the dead. There has never been a time when you and I and the kings gathered here have not existed, nor will there be a time when we will cease to exist. Redemption will come through the fulfillment of a preassigned duty, paired with a recognition that its outward manifestations are illusory because the impermanent has no reality. Reality lies in the eternal. Arjuna, a warrior, has been presented with a war he did not seek. He should accept the circumstances with equanimity and fulfill his role with honor, and must strive to kill and prevail and should not grieve. While Lord Krishna's appeal to duty prevails and Arjuna professes himself freed from doubt, the cataclysms of the war, described in detail in the rest of the epic, add resonance to his earlier qualms. This central work of Hindu thought embodied both an exhortation to war and the importance not so much of avoiding, but of transcending it. Morality was not rejected, but in any given situation the immediate considerations were dominant, while eternity provided a curative perspective. What some readers lauded as a call to fearlessness in battle, Gandhi would praise as his spiritual dictionary. Against the background of the eternal verities of a religion preaching the elusiveness of any single earthly endeavor, the temporal ruler was in fact afforded a wide berth for practical necessities. The pioneering exemplar of this school was the 4th century BC minister Kautilya, credited with engineering the rise of India's Maurya dynasty, which expelled Alexander the Great's successors from northern India and unified the subcontinent for the first time, under a single rule. Kautilya wrote about an India comparable in structure to Europe before the Peace of Westphalia. He describes a collection of states potentially in permanent conflict with each other. Like Machiavelli's, his is an analysis of the world as he found it. It offers a practical, not a normative, guide to action. And its moral basis is identical with that of Richelieu, who lived nearly 2,000 years later. The state is a fragile organization, and the statesman does not have the moral right to risk its survival on ethical restraint. Tradition holds that at some point during or after completing his endeavors, Kautilya recorded the strategic and foreign policy practices he had observed in a comprehensive manual of statecraft, the Arthashastra. This work sets out, with dispassionate clarity, a vision of how to establish and guard a state while neutralizing, subverting, and, when opportune conditions have been established, conquering its neighbors. The Arthashastra encompasses a world of practical statecraft, not philosophical disputation. For Kautilya, power was the dominant reality. It was multidimensional, and its factors were interdependent. All elements in a given situation were relevant, calculable, and amenable to manipulation toward a leader's strategic aims. Geography, finance, military strength, diplomacy, espionage, law, agriculture, cultural traditions, morale and popular opinion, rumors and legends, and men's vices and weaknesses needed to be shaped as a unit by a wise king to strengthen and expand his realm, much as a modern orchestra conductor shapes the instruments in his charge into a coherent tune. It was a combination of Machiavelli and Clausewitz. Millennia before European thinkers translated their facts on the ground into a theory of balance of power, the Arthashastra set out an analogous, if more elaborate, system termed the circle of states. Contiguous polities, in Kautilya's analysis, existed in a state of latent hostility. Whatever professions of amity he might make, Any ruler whose power grew significantly would eventually find that it was in his interest to subvert his neighbor's realm. This was an inherent dynamic of self-preservation to which morality was irrelevant. Much like Frederick the Great 2,000 years later, Kautilya concluded that the ruthless logic of competition allowed no deviation. The conqueror shall, always, endeavor to add to his own power and increase his own happiness. The imperative was clear: if the conqueror is superior, the campaign shall be undertaken, otherwise not. European theorists proclaimed the balance of power as a goal of foreign policy and envisaged a world order based on the equilibrium of states. In the Arthashastra, the purpose of strategy was to conquer all other states and to overcome such equilibrium as existed on the road to victory. In that respect, Kautilya was more comparable to Napoleon and Qin Shi Huang, the emperor who unified China, than to Machiavelli. In Kautilya's view, states had an obligation to pursue self-interest even more than glory. The wise ruler would seek his allies from among his neighbors' neighbors. The goal would be an alliance system with the conqueror at the center. The conqueror shall think of the circle of states as a wheel, himself at the hub and his allies, drawn to him by the spokes though separated by intervening territory, as its rim. The enemy, however strong he may be, becomes vulnerable when he is squeezed between the conqueror and his allies. No alliance is conceived as permanent, however. Even within his own alliance system, the king should undertake such works as would increase his own power, and maneuver to strengthen his state's position and prevent neighboring states from aligning against it. Like the Chinese strategist Sun Tzu, Kautilya held that the least direct course was often the wisest: to foment dissension between neighbors or potential allies, to make one neighboring king fight another neighbor, and having thus prevented the neighbors from getting together, proceed to overrun the territory of his own enemy. The strategic effort is unending. When the strategy prevails, the king's territory expands, and the borders are redrawn. The circle of states would need to be recalibrated. New calculations of power would have to be undertaken. Some allies would now become enemies and vice versa. What our time has labeled covert intelligence operations were described in the Arthashastra as an important tool. Operating in all states of the circle, that is, friends and adversaries alike, and drawn from the ranks of holy ascetics, wandering monks, cart drivers, wandering minstrels, jugglers, tramps, and fortune-tellers. These agents would spread rumors to foment discord within and between other states, subvert enemy armies, and destroy the king's opponents at opportune moments. To be sure, Kautilya insisted that the purpose of the ruthlessness was to build a harmonious universal empire and uphold the Dharma, the timeless moral order whose principles were handed down by the gods. But the appeal to morality and religion was more in the name of practical operational purposes than of principle in its own right, as elements of a conqueror's strategy and tactics, not imperatives of a unifying concept of order. The Arthashastra advised that restrained and humanitarian conduct was under most circumstances strategically useful. A king who abused his subjects would forfeit their support and would be vulnerable to rebellion or invasion. A conqueror who needlessly violated a subdued people's customs or moral sensibilities risked catalyzing resistance. The Arthashastra's exhaustive and matter-of-fact catalogue of the imperatives of success led the distinguished 20th century political theorist Max Weber to conclude that the Arthashastra exemplified truly radical Machiavellianism. Compared to it, Machiavelli's The Prince is harmless. Unlike Machiavelli, Kautilya exhibits no nostalgia for the virtues of a better age. The only criterion of virtue he would accept was whether his analysis of the road to victory was accurate or not. Did he describe the way policy was, in fact, being conducted? In Kautilya's counsel, equilibrium, if it ever came about, was the temporary result of an interaction of self-serving motives. It was not, as in European concepts after Westphalia, the strategic aim of foreign policy. The Arthashastra was a guide to conquest, not to the construction of an international order. Whether following the Arthashastra's prescriptions or not, India reached its high water mark of territorial extent in the 3rd century BC, when its revered Emperor Asoka governed a territory comprising all of today's India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and part of Afghanistan and Iran. Then, about the time when China was being unified by its founding emperor, Qin Shi Huang, in 221 BC, India split into competing kingdoms. Reunified several centuries later, India fractured again in the 7th century, as Islam was beginning to mount its challenge to the empires of Europe and Asia. For nearly a millennium, India, with its fertile soil, wealthy cities, and resplendent intellectual and technological achievements, became a target for conquest and conversion. Waves of conquerors and adventurers, Turks, Afghans, Parthians, Mongols, descended each century from Central and Southwest Asia into the Indian plains, establishing a patchwork of smaller principalities. The subcontinent was thus grafted to the greater Middle East, with ties of religion and ethnicity and strategic sensitivities that endure to this day. For most of this period, the conquerors were too hostile toward each other to permit anyone to control the entire region, or to extinguish the power of Hindu dynasties in the south. Then, in the 16th century, the most skillful of these invaders from the northwest, the Mughals, succeeded in uniting most of the subcontinent under a single rule. The Mughal Empire embodied India's diverse influences, Muslim in faith, Turkic and Mongol in ethnicity, Persian in elite culture. The Mughals ruled over a Hindu majority fragmented by regional identities. In this vortex of languages, cultures, and creeds, the appearance of yet another wave of foreign adventurers in the 16th century did not at first seem to be an epical event. Setting out to profit from an expanding trade with the wealthy Mughal Empire, private British, French, Dutch, and Portuguese companies vied with one another to establish footholds on land in friendly princely states. Britain's Indian realm grew the most, if initially without a fixed design, prompting the Regius Professor of Modern History at Cambridge to say, "We seem, as it were, to have conquered and peopled half the world in a fit of absence of mind." Once a base of British power and commerce was established in the eastern region of Bengal, it found itself surrounded by competitors, European and Asian. With each war in Europe and the Americas, the British in India clashed with rivals' colonies and allies. With each victory, they acquired the adversary's Indian assets. As Britain's possessions, technically the holdings of the East India Company, not the British state itself, expanded, it considered itself threatened by Russia looming to the north, by Burma by turns militant and fragmented, and by ambitious and increasingly autonomous Mughal rulers, thus justifying, in British eyes, further annexations. Ultimately, Britain found itself conceiving of an Indian entity whose unity was based on the security of a continental swath of territories, encompassing the contemporary states of Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. Something akin to an Indian national interest was defined, ascribed to a geographic unit that was, in fact, run as a state even in the absence, it was assumed, of an Indian nation. That policy based the security of India on British naval supremacy in the Indian Ocean, on friendly, or at least non-threatening, regimes as far-flung as Singapore and Aden, and on a non-hostile regime at the Khyber Pass and the Himalayas. In the north, Britain fended off Tsarist Russia's advances through the complex forays of spies, explorers, and indigenous surrogates backed up by small contingents of British forces, in what came to be known as the Great Game of Himalayan geostrategy. It also edged India's borders with China north toward Tibet, an issue that arose again in China's war with India in 1962. Contemporary analogues to these policies have been taken over as key elements of the foreign policy of post-independence India. They amount to a regional order for South Asia, whose linchpin would be India, and the opposition of any country's attempts, regardless of its domestic structure, to achieve a threatening concentration of power in the neighboring territories. When London responded to the 1857 mutiny of Muslim and Hindu soldiers in the East India Company's army, by declaring direct British rule, it did not conceive of this act as establishing British governance over a foreign nation. Rather, it saw itself as a neutral overseer and civilizing uplifter of multifarious peoples and states. As late as 1888, a leading British administrator could declare, "There is not, and never was in India, or even any country of India possessing, according to any European ideas, any sort of unity, physical, political, social, or religious." You might with as much reason and probability look forward to a time when a single nation will have taken the place of the various nations of Europe. By deciding after the mutiny to administer India as a single imperial unit, Britain did much to bring such an India into being. The diverse regions were connected by rail lines and a common language, English. The glories of India's ancient civilization were researched and catalogued, and India's elite trained in British thought and institutions. In the process, Britain reawakened in India the consciousness that it was a single entity under foreign rule and inspired a sentiment that to defeat the foreign influence it had to constitute itself as a nation. Britain's impact on India was thus similar to Napoleon's on a Germany whose multiple states had been treated previously only as a geographic, not a national, entity. The manner in which India achieved its independence and charted its world role reflected these diverse legacies. India had survived through the centuries by combining cultural imperviousness with extraordinary psychological skill in dealing with occupiers. Mohandas Gandhi's passive resistance to British rule was made possible in the first instance by the spiritual uplift of the Mahatma, but it also proved to be the most effective way to fight the imperial power because of its appeal to the core values of freedom, of liberal British society. Like Americans 2 centuries earlier, Indians vindicated their independence by invoking against their colonial rulers concepts of liberty they had studied in British schools, including at the London School of Economics, where India's future leaders absorbed many of their quasi-socialist ideas. Modern India conceived of its independence as a triumph not only of a nation but of universal moral principles. And like America's founding fathers, India's early leaders equated the national interest with moral rectitude. But India's leaders have acted on Westphalian principles with respect to spreading their domestic institutions, with little interest in promoting democracy and human rights practices internationally. As Prime Minister of a newly independent state, Jawaharlal Nehru argued that the basis of India's foreign policy would be India's national interests, not international amity per se or the cultivation of compatible domestic systems. In a speech in 1947, shortly after independence, he explained, "Whatever policy you may lay down, the art of conducting the foreign affairs of a country lies in finding out what is most advantageous to the country. We may talk about international goodwill and mean what we say. But in the ultimate analysis, a government functions for the good of the country it governs, and no government dare do anything which in the short or long run is manifestly to the disadvantage of that country. Kautilya, and Machiavelli, could not have said it better. Nehru and subsequent prime ministers, including his daughter, the formidable Indira Gandhi, proceeded to buttress India's position as part of the global equilibrium by elevating their foreign policy into an expression of India's superior moral authority. India presented the vindication of its own national interest as a uniquely enlightened enterprise, much as America had nearly 2 centuries earlier. And Nehru and later Indira Gandhi, Prime Minister from 1966 to 1977 and 1980 to 1984, succeeded in establishing their fledgling nation as one of the principal elements of the post-World War II international order. The content of non-alignment was different from the policy undertaken by a balancer in a balance of power system. India was not prepared to move toward the weaker side, as a balancer would. It was not interested in operating an international system. Its overriding impulse was not to be found formally in either camp, and it measured its success by not being drawn into conflicts that did not affect its national interests. Emerging into a world of established powers and the Cold War, independent India subtly elevated freedom of maneuver from a bargaining tactic into an ethical principle. Blending righteous moralism with a shrewd assessment of the balance of forces and the major powers' psychologies, Nehru announced India to be a global power that would chart a course maneuvering between the major blocs. In 1947, he stated in a message to the new republic, "We propose to avoid entanglement in any blocs or groups of powers, realizing that only thus can we serve not only the cause of India but of world peace." This policy sometimes leads partisans of one group to imagine that we are supporting the other group. Every nation places its own interests first in developing foreign policy. Fortunately, India's interests coincide with peaceful foreign policy and cooperation with all progressive nations. Inevitably, India will be drawn closer to those countries which are friendly and cooperative to her. In other words, India was neutral and above power politics, partly as a matter of principle in the interest of world peace, but equally on the grounds of national interest. During the Soviet ultimatums on Berlin between 1957 and 1962, 2 American administrations, especially John F. Kennedy's, had sought Indian support on behalf of an isolated city seeking to maintain its free status. But India took the position that any attempt to impose on it the norms of a Cold War bloc would deprive it of its freedom of action, and therefore of its bargaining position. Short-term moral neutrality would be the means toward long-term moral influence. As Nehru told his aides, it would have been absurd and impolitic for the Indian delegation to avoid the Soviet bloc for fear of irritating the Americans. A time may come when we may say clearly and definitely to the Americans or others that if their attitude continues to be unfriendly, we shall necessarily seek friends elsewhere. The essence of this strategy was that it allowed India to draw support from both Cold War camps, securing the military aid and diplomatic cooperation of the Soviet bloc, even while courting American development assistance and the moral support of the U.S. intellectual establishment. However irritating to Cold War America, it was a wise course for an emerging nation. With a then nascent military establishment and underdeveloped economy, India would have been a respected but secondary ally. As a free agent, it could exercise a much wider-reaching influence. In pursuit of such a role, India set out to build a bloc of like-minded states, in effect, an alignment of the non-aligned. As Nehru told the delegates of the 1955 Afro-Asian Conference in Bandung, Indonesia, "Are we, the countries of Asia and Africa, devoid of any positive position except being pro-communist or anti-communist? has it come to this, that the leaders of thought who have given religions and all kinds of things to the world have to tag on to this kind of group or that, and be hangers-on of this party or the other, carrying out their wishes and occasionally giving an idea? It is most degrading and humiliating to any self-respecting people or nation. It is an intolerable thought to me that the great countries of Asia and Africa should come out of bondage into freedom only to degrade themselves, or humiliate themselves in this way. The ultimate rationale for India's rejection of what it described as the power politics of the Cold War was that it saw no national interest in the disputes at issue. For the sake of disputes along the dividing lines in Europe, India would not challenge the Soviet Union only a few hundred miles away, which it wished to give no incentive to join up with Pakistan. Nor would it risk Muslim hostility on behalf of Middle East controversies. India refrained from judgment of North Korea's invasion of South Korea and North Vietnam's subversion of South Vietnam. India's leaders were determined not to isolate themselves from what they identified as the progressive trends in the developing world, or risk the hostility of the Soviet superpower. Nevertheless, India found itself involved in a war with China in 1962 and 4 wars with Pakistan, one of which, in 1971, was carried out under the protection of a freshly signed Soviet defense treaty and ended with the division of India's principal adversary into 2 separate states, Pakistan and Bangladesh, greatly improving India's overall strategic position. In quest of a leading role among the non-aligned, India was adhering to a concept of international order compatible with the inherited one on both the global and regional level. Its formal articulation was classically Westphalian and congruent with historical European analyses of the balance of power. Nehru defined India's approach in terms of 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. Though given the name of an Indian philosophical concept, Panchashila, 5 principles of coexistence, these were in effect a more high-minded recapitulation of the Westphalian model for a multipolar order of sovereign states. 1. Mutual respect for each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty. 2. Mutual non-aggression. 3. Mutual non-interference in each other's internal affairs. 4. Equality and mutual benefit, and 5. Peaceful coexistence. India's advocacy of abstract principles of world order was accompanied by a doctrine for Indian security on the regional level. Just as the early American leaders developed in the Monroe Doctrine a concept for America's special role in the Western Hemisphere, so India has established in practice a special position in the Indian Ocean region between the East Indies and the Horn of Africa. Like Britain with respect to Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, India strives to prevent the emergence of a dominant power in this vast portion of the globe. Just as early American leaders did not seek the approval of the countries of the Western Hemisphere with respect to the Monroe Doctrine, so India in the region of its special strategic interests conducts its policy on the basis of its own definition of a South Asian order. And while American and Indian views often clashed on the conduct of the Cold War, they have, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, been largely parallel for the Indian Ocean region and its peripheries. With the end of the Cold War, India was freed from many conflicting pressures and some of its socialist infatuations. It engaged in economic reform, triggered by a balance of payments crisis in 1991 and assisted by an IMF program. Indian companies now lead some of the world's major industries. This new direction is reflected in India's diplomatic posture, with new partnerships globally and in particular throughout Africa and Asia, and with a heightened regard around the world for India's role in multilateral economic and financial institutions. In addition to its growing economic and diplomatic influence, India has considerably enhanced its military power, including its navy and stockpile of nuclear weapons. And in a few decades, it will surpass China as Asia's most populous country. India's role in world order is complicated by structural factors related to its founding. Among the most complex will be its relations with its closest neighbors, particularly Pakistan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, and China. Their ambivalent ties and antagonisms reflect a legacy of a millennium of competing invasions and migrations into the subcontinent, of Britain's forays on the fringes of its Indian realm, and of the rapid end of British colonial rule in the immediate aftermath of World War II. No successor state has accepted the boundaries of the 1947 partition of the subcontinent in full. Treated as provisional by one party or another, the disputed borders have ever since been the cause of sporadic communal violence, military clashes, and terrorist infiltration. The borders with Pakistan, which roughly traced the concentrations of Islam on the subcontinent, cut across ethnic boundaries. They brought into being a state based on the Muslim religion in two non-contiguous parts of what had been British India, divided by thousands of miles of Indian territory, setting the stage for multiple subsequent wars. Borders with Afghanistan and China were proclaimed based on lines drawn by 19th-century British colonial administrators, later disclaimed by the opposite parties and to this day disputed. India and Pakistan have each invested heavily in a nuclear weapons arsenal and regional military postures. Pakistan also tolerates, when it does not abet, violent extremism, including terrorism in Afghanistan and in India itself. A particular complicating factor will be India's relations with the larger Muslim world, of which it forms an integral part. India is often classified as an East Asian or South Asian country. But it has deeper historical links with the Middle East and a larger Muslim population than Pakistan itself, indeed than any Muslim country except Indonesia. India has thus far been able to wall itself off from the harshest currents of political turmoil and sectarian violence, partly through enlightened treatment of its minorities and a fostering of common Indian domestic principles, including democracy and nationalism, transcending communal differences. Yet this outcome is not foreordained, and maintaining it will require concerted efforts. A further radicalization of the Arab world or heightened civil conflict in Pakistan could expose India to significant internal pressures. Today, India pursues a foreign policy in many ways similar to the quest of the former British Raj as it seeks to base a regional order on a balance of power in an arc stretching halfway across the world, from the Middle East to Singapore, and then north to Afghanistan. Its relations with China, Japan, and Southeast Asia follow a pattern akin to the 19th-century European equilibrium. Like China, it does not hesitate to use distant barbarians like the United States to help achieve its regional aims, though in describing their policies, both countries would use more elegant terms. In the administration of George W. Bush, a strategic coordination between India and America on a global scale was occasionally discussed. It remained confined to the South Asia region because India's traditional non-alignment stood in the way of a global arrangement, and because neither country was willing to adopt confrontation with China as a permanent principle of national policy. Like the 19th-century British, who were driven to deepen their global involvement to protect strategic routes to India, over the course of the 21st century India has felt obliged to play a growing strategic role in Asia and the Muslim world to prevent these regions' domination by countries or ideologies it considers hostile. In pursuing this course, India has had natural ties to the countries of the English-speaking Anglosphere. Yet it will likely continue to honor the legacy of Nehru by preserving freedom of maneuver in its Asian and Middle Eastern relations, and in its policies toward key autocratic countries, access to whose resources India will require to maintain its expansive economic plans. These priorities will create their own imperatives transcending historical attitudes. With the reconfiguration of the American position in the Middle East, the various regional countries will seek new partners to buttress their positions and to develop some kind of regional order. And India's own strategic analysis will not permit a vacuum in Afghanistan or the hegemony in Asia of another power. Under a Hindu nationalist-led government elected by decisive margins in May 2014 on a platform of reform and economic growth, India can be expected to pursue its traditional foreign policy goals with added vigor. With a firm mandate and charismatic leadership, the administration of Narendra Modi may consider itself in a position to chart new directions on historic issues like the conflict with Pakistan or the relationship with China. With India, Japan, and China all led by strong and strategically oriented administrations, the scope both for intensified rivalries and for potential bold resolutions will expand. In any of these evolutions, India will be a fulcrum of 21st century order, an indispensable element, based on its geography, resources, and tradition of sophisticated leadership, in the strategic and ideological evolution of the regions and the concepts of order at whose intersection it stands. What is an Asian regional order? The historical European order had been self-contained. England was, until the early 20th century, able to preserve the balance through its insular position and naval supremacy. Occasionally, European powers enlisted outside countries to strengthen their positions temporarily, for example, France courting the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century or Britain's early 20th century alliance with Japan, but non-Western powers, other than occasional surges from the Middle East or North Africa, had few interests in Europe and were not called on to intervene in European conflicts. By contrast, the contemporary Asian order includes outside powers as an integral feature, the United States, whose role as an Asia-Pacific power was explicitly affirmed in joint statements by U.S. President Barack Obama and Chinese President Hu Jintao in January 2011, and Chinese President Xi Jinping in June 2013, and Russia, geographically an Asian power and participant in Asian groupings such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, even if over three-quarters of its population lives in the European portion of Russian territory. The United States in modern times has occasionally been invited to act as a balancer of power. In the Treaty of Portsmouth of 1905, it mediated the war between Russia and Japan. In World War II, it defeated Japan's quest for Asian hegemony. The United States played a comparable Asian role during the Cold War when it sought to balance the Soviet Union through a network of alliances, stretching from Pakistan to the Philippines. The evolving Asian structure will have to take into account a plethora of states not dealt with in the preceding pages. Indonesia, anchoring Southeast Asia while affirming an Islamic orientation, plays an increasingly influential role and has thus far managed a delicate balancing act between China, the United States, and the Muslim world. With Japan, Russia, and China as neighbors, the Republic of Korea has achieved a vibrant democracy bolstered by a globally competitive economy, including leadership in strategic industries such as telecommunications and shipbuilding. Many Asian countries, including China, view North Korea's policies as destabilizing but regard a collapse of North Korea as a greater danger. South Korea on its part will have to deal with increasing domestic pressures for unification. In the face of Asia's vast scale and the scope of its diversity, its nations have fashioned a dazzling array of multilateral groupings and bilateral mechanisms. In contrast to the European Union, NATO, and the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, these institutions deal with security and economic issues on a case-by-case basis, not as an expression of formal rules of regional order. Some of the key groupings include the United States, and some, including economic ones, are Asian only, of which the most elaborated and significant is ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. The core principle is to welcome those nations most directly involved with the issues at hand. But does all this amount to an Asian system of order? In Europe's equilibrium, the interests of the main parties were comparable, if not congruent. A balance of power could be developed not only in practice, as is inevitable in the absence of hegemony, but as a system of legitimacy that facilitated decisions and moderated policies. Such a congruence does not exist in Asia, as is shown by the priorities the major countries have assigned to themselves. While India appears mostly concerned with China as a peer competitor, in large measure a legacy of the 1962 border war, China sees its peer rivals in Japan and the United States. India has devoted fewer military resources to China than to Pakistan, which, if not a peer competitor, has been a strategic preoccupation for New Delhi. The amorphous nature of Asian groupings is partly because geography has dictated a sharp dividing line between East Asia and South Asia throughout history. Cultural, philosophical, and religious influences have transcended the geographic dividing lines, and Hindu and Confucian concepts of governance have coexisted in Southeast Asia. But the mountain and jungle barriers were too impenetrable to permit military interaction between the great empires of East Asia and South Asia until the 20th century. The Mongols and their successors entered the Indian subcontinent from Central Asia, not through the Himalayan high passes, and they failed to reach the southern parts of India. The various regions of Asia have geopolitically and historically pursued distinct courses. The regional orders constructed during these periods included none based on Westphalian premises. Where the European order embraced an equilibrium of territorially defined, sovereign states, recognizing each other's legal equality, traditional Asian political powers operated by more ambiguous criteria. Until well into the modern era, an inner Asian world influenced by the Mongol Empire, Russia, and Islam coexisted with a Chinese imperial tribute system. The latter reached outward to the kingdoms of Southeast Asia, which entertained China's claims of universality even as they practiced a form of statecraft deeply influenced by Hindu principles, received from India that posited a form of divinity for monarchs. Now these legacies are meeting, and there is far from a consensus among the various countries about the meaning of the journey they have taken or its lessons for 21st-century world order. Under contemporary conditions, essentially two balances of power are emerging, one in South Asia, the other in East Asia. Neither possesses the characteristic integral to the European balance of power, a balancer, a country capable of establishing an equilibrium by shifting its weight to the weaker side. The United States, after its withdrawal from Afghanistan, has refrained from treating the contemporary internal South Asian balance primarily as a military problem. But it will have to be active in the diplomacy over re-establishing a regional order lest a vacuum is created, which would inevitably draw all surrounding countries into a regional confrontation. World Order by Henry Kissinger. Reflections on the Character of Nations and the Course of History. Chapter 6, Toward an Asian Order, Confrontation or Partnership. A. Asia's international order and China. B. China and world order. C. A longer perspective. Chapter 6. Toward an Asian order, confrontation or partnership. The most common feature of Asian states is their sense of representing emerging, or post-colonial, countries. All have sought to overcome the legacy of colonial rule by asserting a strong national identity. They share a conviction that world order is now rebalancing after an unnatural Western eruption over the past several centuries, but they have drawn vastly different lessons from their historical journeys. When top officials seek to evoke core interests, many of them look to a different cultural tradition and idealize a different golden age. In Europe's 18th and 19th century systems, the preservation of the equilibrium, and by implication the status quo, was seen as a positive virtue. In Asia, almost every state is impelled by its own dynamism. Convinced that it is arising, it operates with the conviction that the world has yet to affirm its full deserved role. Even while no state questions the other's sovereignty and dignity and all affirm a dedication to non-zero-sum diplomacy, the simultaneous pursuit of so many programs of national prestige building introduces a measure of volatility to the regional order. With the evolution of modern technology, the major powers of Asia have armed themselves with far more destructive military arsenals than even the strongest 19th-century European state possessed, compounding the risks of miscalculation. The organization of Asia is thus an inherent challenge for world order. Major countries' perception and pursuit of their national interests, rather than the balance of power as a system, have shaped the mechanisms of order that have developed. Their test will be whether a trans-Pacific partnership, providing a peaceful framework for the interplay of many established interests, will be possible. Asia's international order and China. Of all conceptions of world order in Asia, China operated the longest lasting, the most clearly defined, and the one furthest from Westphalian ideas. China has also taken the most complex journey, from ancient civilization through classical empire, to communist revolution, to modern great power status, a course which will have a profound impact on mankind. From its unification as a single political entity in 221 BC through the early 20th century, China's position at the center of world order was so ingrained in its elite thinking that in the Chinese language, there was no word for it. Only retrospectively did scholars define the sinocentric attribute system. In this traditional concept, China considered itself, in a sense, the sole sovereign government of the world. Its emperor was treated as a figure of cosmic dimensions and the linchpin between the human and the divine. His purview was not a sovereign state of China, that is, the territories immediately under his rule, but all under heaven, of which China formed the central, civilized part, the Middle Kingdom, inspiring and uplifting the rest of humanity. In this view, world order reflected a universal hierarchy, not an equilibrium of competing sovereign states. Every known society was conceived of as being in some kind of tributary relationship with China, based in part on its approximation of Chinese culture. None could reach equality with it. Other monarchs were not fellow sovereigns but earnest pupils in the art of governance, striving toward civilization. Diplomacy was not a bargaining process between multiple sovereign interests but a series of carefully contrived ceremonies, in which foreign societies were given the opportunity to affirm their assigned place in the global hierarchy. In keeping with this perspective, in classical China what would now be called foreign policy was the province of the Ministry of Rituals, which determined the shades of the tributary relationship, and the Office of Border Affairs, charged with managing relations with nomadic tribes. A Chinese foreign ministry was not established until the mid-19th century, and then perforce to deal with intruders from the West. Even then, officials considered their task the traditional practice of barbarian management, not anything that might be regarded as Westphalian diplomacy. The new ministry carried the telling title of the Office for the Management of the Affairs of All Nations, implying that China was not engaging in interstate diplomacy at all. The goal of the tribute system was to foster deference, not to extract economic benefit or to dominate foreign societies militarily. China's most imposing architectural achievement, the Great Wall eventually extending over roughly 5,000 miles, was begun by the Emperor Qin Shi Huang, who had just defeated all rivals militarily, ending the period of warring states and unifying China. It was a grandiose testimony to military victory but also to its inherent limits, denoting vast power coupled with a consciousness of vulnerability. For millennia, China sought to beguile and entice its adversaries more often than it attempted to defeat them by force of arms. Thus a minister in the Han Dynasty, 206 B.C.A.D. 220, described the 5 baits, with which he proposed to manage the mounted Xiongnu tribes to China's northwestern frontier, though by conventional analysis China was the superior military power. To give them elaborate clothes and carriages in order to corrupt their eyes, to give them fine food in order to corrupt their mouth, to give them music and women in order to corrupt their ears, to provide them with lofty buildings, granaries and slaves in order to corrupt their stomach, and, as for those who come to surrender, the emperor should show them favor by honoring them with an imperial reception party in which the emperor should personally serve them wine and food so as to corrupt their mind. These are what may be called the 5 baits. The hallmark of China's diplomatic rituals, the kowtow, kneeling and touching one's head to the ground to acknowledge the emperor's superior authority, was an abasement, to be sure, and proved a stumbling block to relations with modern Western states. But the kowtow was symbolically voluntary. It was the representative deference of a people that had been not so much conquered as awed. The tribute presented to China on such occasions was often exceeded in value by the emperor's return gifts. Traditionally, China sought to dominate psychologically by its achievements and its conduct, interspersed with occasional military excursions to teach recalcitrant barbarians a lesson and to induce respect. Both these strategic goals and this fundamentally psychological approach to armed conflict were in evidence as recently as China's wars with India in 1962 and Vietnam in 1979, as well as in the manner in which core interests vis-a-vis other neighbors are affirmed. Still, China was not a missionary society in the Western sense of the term. It sought to induce respect, not conversion. That subtle line could never be crossed. Its mission was its performance, which foreign societies were expected to recognize and acknowledge. It was possible for another country to become a friend, even an old friend, but it could never be treated as China's peer. Ironically, the only foreigners who achieved something akin to this status were conquerors. In one of history's most amazing feats of cultural imperialism, 2 peoples that conquered China, the Mongols in the 13th century and the Manchus in the 17th, were induced to adopt core elements of Chinese culture to facilitate the administration of a people so numerous and so obdurate in its assumption of cultural superiority. The conquerors were significantly assimilated by the defeated Chinese society, to a point where substantial parts of their home territory came to be treated as traditionally Chinese. China had not sought to export its political system, rather, it had seen others come to it. In that sense, it has expanded not by conquest but by osmosis. In the modern era, Western representatives with their own sense of cultural superiority set out to enroll China in the European world system, which was becoming the basic structure of international order. They pressured China to cultivate ties with the rest of the world through exchanges of ambassadors and free trade, and to uplift its people through a modernizing economy and a society open to Christian proselytizing. What the West conceived of as a process of enlightenment and engagement was treated in China as an assault. China tried at first to parry it and then to resist outright. When the first British envoy, George Macartney, arrived in the late 18th century, bringing with him some early products of the Industrial Revolution and a letter from King George III proposing free trade and the establishment of reciprocal resident embassies in Beijing and London, the Chinese boat that carried him from Guangzhou to Beijing was festooned with a banner that identified him as the English ambassador bringing tribute to the Emperor of China. He was dismissed with a letter to the King of England explaining that no ambassador could be permitted to reside in Beijing because Europe consists of many other nations besides your own. If each and all demanded to be represented at our court, how could we possibly consent? The thing is utterly impracticable. The emperor saw no need for trade beyond what was already occurring in limited, tightly regulated amounts, because Britain had no goods China desired. Swaying the wide world, I have but one aim in view, namely, to maintain a perfect governance and to fulfill the duties of the state. Strange and costly objects do not interest me. If I have commanded that the tribute offerings sent by you, O King, are to be accepted, this was solely in consideration for the spirit which prompted you to dispatch them from afar. As your ambassador can see for himself, we possess all things. After the defeat of Napoleon, as its mercantile expansion gathered pace, Britain attempted another overture, dispatching a second envoy with a similar proposal. Britain's display of naval power during the Napoleonic Wars had done little to change China's estimate of the desirability of diplomatic relations. When William Amherst, the envoy, declined to attend the kowtow ceremony, offering the excuse that his dress uniform had been delayed, his mission was dismissed, and any further attempt at diplomacy was explicitly discouraged. The emperor dispatched a message to England's Prince Regent, explaining that as overlord of all under heaven, China could not be troubled to walk each barbarian envoy through the correct protocol. The imperial records would duly acknowledge that thy kingdom far away across the oceans proffers its loyalty and yearns for civilization, but as a 19th-century Western missionary publication translated the edict, henceforward no more envoys need be sent over this distant route, as the result is but a vain waste of traveling energy. If thou canst but incline thine heart to submissive service, thou mayest dispense with sending missions to court at certain periods. That is the true way to turn towards civilization. That thou mayest forever obey, we now issue this mandate. Though such admonitions seem presumptuous by today's standards, and were deeply offensive to the country that had just maintained the European equilibrium and could count itself Europe's most advanced naval, economic, and industrial power, the emperor was expressing himself in a manner consistent with the ideas about his place in the world that had prevailed for millennia, and that many neighboring peoples had been induced to at least indulge. The Western powers, to their shame, eventually brought matters to a head over the issue of free trade in the most self-evidently harmful product they sold, insisting on the right to the unrestricted importation of, from all the fruits of Western progress, opium. China in the late Qing dynasty had neglected its military technology partly because it had been unchallenged for so long, but largely because of the low status of the military in China's Confucian social hierarchy, expressed in the saying, "Good iron is not used for nails. Good men do not become soldiers." Even when under assault by Western forces, the Qing dynasty diverted military funds in 1893 to restore a resplendent marble boat in the imperial summer palace. Temporarily overwhelmed by military pressure in 1842, China signed treaties conceding Western demands. But it did not abandon its sense of uniqueness and fought a tenacious rearguard action. After scoring a decisive victory in an 1856–58 war, fought over an alleged improper impoundment of a British-registered ship in Guangzhou, Britain insisted on a treaty enshrining its long-sought right to station a resident minister in Beijing. Arriving the next year to take up his post with a triumphal retinue, the British envoy found the main river route to the capital blocked with chains and spikes. When he ordered a contingent of British Marines to clear the obstacles, Chinese forces opened fire. 519 British troops died and another 456 were wounded in the ensuing battle. Britain then dispatched a military force under Lord Elgin that stormed Beijing and burned the Summer Palace as the Qing court fled. This brutal intervention compelled the ruling dynasty's grudging acceptance of a legation quarter to house the diplomatic representatives. China's acquiescence in the concept of reciprocal diplomacy within a Westphalian system of sovereign states was reluctant and resentful. At the heart of these disputes was a larger question: was China a world order entire unto itself, or a state like others that was part of a wider international system? China clung to the traditional premise. As late as 1863, after two military defeats by barbarian powers and a massive domestic uprising, the Taiping Rebellion, quelled only by calling in foreign troops, the emperor dispatched a letter to Abraham Lincoln assuring him of China's benign favor, having, with reverence, received the commission from heaven to rule the universe. We regard both the Middle Empire, China, and the outside countries as constituting one family, without any distinction. In 1872, the eminent Scottish sinologist James Legge phrased the issue pointedly and with his era's characteristic confidence, in the self-evident superiority of the Western concept of world order. During the past 40 years China's position with regard to the more advanced nations of the world has been entirely changed. She has entered into treaties with them upon equal terms, but I do not think her ministers and people have yet looked this truth fairly in the face, so as to realize the fact that China is only one of many independent nations in the world, and that the beneath the sky, over which her emperor has rule, is not all beneath the sky, but only a certain portion of it which is defined on the Earth's surface and can be pointed out upon the map. With technology and trade impelling contradictory systems into closer contact, which world order's norms would prevail? In Europe, the Westphalian system was an outgrowth of a plethora of de facto independent states at the end of the 30 Years' War. Asia entered the modern era without such a distinct apparatus of national and international organization. It possessed several civilizational centers surrounded by smaller kingdoms, with a subtle and shifting set of mechanisms for interactions between them. The rich fertility of China's plains and a culture of uncommon resilience and political acumen had enabled China to remain unified over much of a two-millennia period and to exercise considerable political, economic, and cultural influence, even when it was militarily weak by conventional standards. Its comparative advantage resided in the wealth of its economy, which produced goods that all of its neighbors desired. Shaped by these elements, the Chinese idea of world order differed markedly from the European experience based on a multiplicity of co-equal states. The drama of China's encounter with the developed West and Japan was the impact of great powers, organized as expansionist states, on a civilization that initially saw the trappings of modern statehood as an abasement. The rise of China to eminence in the 21st century is not new, but re-establishes historic patterns. What is distinctive is that China has returned as both the inheritor of an ancient civilization, and as a contemporary great power on the Westphalian model. It combines the legacies of all under heaven, technocratic modernization, and an unusually turbulent 20th century national quest for a synthesis between the two. China and world order. The imperial dynasty collapsed in 1911, and the foundation of a Chinese republic under Sun Yat-sen in 1912 left China with a weak central government, and ushered in a decade of warlordism. A stronger central government under Chiang Kai-shek emerged in 1928 and sought to enable China to assume a place in the Westphalian concept of world order and in the global economic system. Seeking to be both modern and traditionally Chinese, it attempted to fit into an international system that was itself in upheaval. Yet at that point, Japan, which had launched its modernization drive half a century earlier, began a bid for Asian hegemony. The occupation of Manchuria in 1931 was followed by Japan's invasion of large stretches of central and eastern China in 1937. The nationalist government was prevented from consolidating its position, and the communist insurgency was given breathing space. Though emerging as one of the victorious Allied powers with the end of World War II in 1945, China was torn apart by civil war and revolutionary turmoil that challenged all relationships and legacies. On October 1, 1949, in Beijing, the victorious Communist Party leader Mao Zedong proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China with the words, "The Chinese people have stood up." Mao elaborated this slogan as a China purifying and strengthening itself through a doctrine of continuous revolution, and proceeded to dismantle established concepts of domestic and international order. The entire institutional spectrum came under attack: Western democracy, Soviet leadership of the communist world, and the legacy of the Chinese past. Art and monuments, holidays and traditions, vocabulary and dress, fell under various forms of interdict, blamed for bringing about the passivity that had rendered China unprepared in the face of foreign intrusions. In Mao's concept of order, which he called the Great Harmony, echoing classical Chinese philosophy, a new China would emerge out of the destruction of traditional Confucian culture emphasizing harmony. Each wave of revolutionary exertion, he proclaimed, would serve as a precursor to the next. The process of revolution must be ever accelerated, Mao held, lest the revolutionaries become complacent and indolent. Disequilibrium is a general, objective rule, wrote Mao. The cycle, which is endless, evolves from disequilibrium to equilibrium and then to disequilibrium again. Each cycle, however, brings us to a higher level of development. Disequilibrium is normal and absolute, whereas equilibrium is temporary and relative. In the end, this upheaval was designed to produce a kind of traditional Chinese outcome, a form of communism intrinsic to China, setting itself apart by a distinctive form of conduct that swayed by its achievements, with China's unique and now revolutionary moral authority again swaying, all under heaven. Mao conducted international affairs by the same reliance on the unique nature of China. Though China was objectively weak by the way the rest of the world measured strength, Mao insisted on its central role via psychological and ideological superiority, to be demonstrated by defying rather than conciliating a world emphasizing superior physical power. When speaking in Moscow to an international conference of Communist Party leaders in 1957, Mao shocked fellow delegates by predicting that in the event of nuclear war, China's more numerous population and hardier culture would be the ultimate victor, and that even casualties of hundreds of millions would not deflect China from its revolutionary course. While this might have been partly bluff to discourage countries with vastly superior nuclear arsenals, Mao wanted the world to believe that he contemplated nuclear war with equanimity. In July 1971, during my secret visit to Beijing, Zhou Enlai summed up Mao's conception of world order by invoking the chairman's claimed purview of Chinese emperors with a sardonic twist. All under heaven is in chaos, the situation is excellent. From a world of chaos, the People's Republic, hardened by years of struggle, would ultimately emerge triumphant not just in China but everywhere under heaven. The communist world order would merge with the traditional view of the imperial court. Like the founder of China's first all-powerful dynasty, 221 to 207 BC, the Emperor Qin Shi Huang, Mao sought to unify China while also striving to destroy the ancient culture that he blamed for China's weakness and humiliation. He governed in a style as remote as that of any emperor, though the emperors would not have convened mass rallies, and he combined it with the practices of Lenin and Stalin. Mao's rule embodied the revolutionary's dilemma. The more sweeping the changes the revolutionary seeks to bring about, the more he encounters resistance, not necessarily from ideological and political opponents but from the inertia of the familiar. The revolutionary prophet is ever tempted to defy his mortality by speeding up his timetable and multiplying the means of enforcing his vision. Mao launched his disastrous Great Leap Forward in 1958 to compel breakneck industrialization, and the Cultural Revolution in 1966 to purge the ruling group to prevent its institutionalization in a decade-long ideological campaign that exiled a generation of educated youth to the countryside. Tens of millions died in pursuit of Mao's goals, most eliminated without love or hatred, mobilized to foreshorten into one lifetime what had heretofore been considered a historical process. Revolutionaries prevail when their achievements come to be taken for granted and the price paid for them is treated as inevitable. Some of China's contemporary leaders suffered grievously during the Cultural Revolution, but they now present that suffering as having given them the strength and self-discovery to steel themselves for the daunting tasks of leading another period of vast transformation. And the Chinese public, especially those too young to have experienced the travail directly, seems to accept the depiction of Mao as primarily a unifier on behalf of Chinese dignity. Which aspect of this legacy prevails? The taunting Maoist challenge to the world or the quiet resolve gained through weathering Mao's upheavals will do much to determine China's relationship with 21st-century world order. In the early stages of the Cultural Revolution, China by its own choice had only 4 ambassadors around the world and was in confrontation with both nuclear superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. By the end of the 1960s, Mao recognized that the Cultural Revolution had exhausted even the Chinese people's millennially tested capacity for endurance, and that China's isolation might tempt the foreign interventions he had sought to overcome by ideological rigor and defiance. In 1969, the Soviet Union seemed on the verge of attacking China to a point that caused Mao to disperse all ministries to the provinces, with only Premier Zhou Enlai remaining in Beijing. To this crisis, Mao reacted with a characteristically unexpected reversal of direction. He ended the most anarchical aspects of the Cultural Revolution by using the armed forces to put an end to the Red Guards, who had been his shock troops, sending them to the countryside, where they joined their erstwhile victims at, in effect, forced labor. And he strove to checkmate the Soviet Union by moving toward the heretofore vilified adversary, the United States. Mao calculated that the opening with the United States would end China's isolation and provide other countries that were holding back with a justification for recognizing the People's Republic of China. Interestingly, a CIA analysis, written as I was preparing for my first trip, held that Sino-Soviet tensions were so great as to make a US-China rapprochement possible, but that Mao's ideological fervor would prevent it in his lifetime. Revolutions, no matter how sweeping, need to be consolidated and, in the end, adapted from a moment of exaltation to what is sustainable over a period of time. That was the historic role played by Deng Xiaoping. Although he had been twice purged by Mao, he became the effective ruler 2 years after Mao's death in 1976. He quickly undertook to reform the economy and open up the society. Pursuing what he defined as socialism with Chinese characteristics, he liberated the latent energies of the Chinese people. Within less than a generation, China advanced to become the second-largest economy in the world. To speed up this dramatic transformation, if not necessarily by conviction, China entered international institutions and accepted the established rules of world order. Yet China's participation in aspects of the Westphalian structure carried with it an ambivalence born of the history that brought it to enter into the international state system. China has not forgotten that it was originally forced to engage with the existing international order in a manner utterly at odds with its historical image of itself or, for that matter, with the avowed principles of the Westphalian system. When urged to adhere to the international system's rules of the game and responsibilities, the visceral reaction of many Chinese, including senior leaders, has been profoundly affected by the awareness that China has not participated in making the rules of the system. They are asked, and, as a matter of prudence, have agreed, to adhere to rules they had had no part in making. But they expect, and sooner or later will act on this expectation, the international order to evolve in a way that enables China to become centrally involved in further international rule-making, even to the point of revising some of the rules that prevail. While waiting for this to transpire, Beijing has become much more active on the world scene. With China's emergence as potentially the world's largest economy, its views and support are now sought in every international forum. China has participated in many of the prestige aspects of the 19th and 20th century Western orders, hosting the Olympics, addresses by its presidents before the United Nations, reciprocal visits with heads of state and governments from leading countries around the world. By any standard, China has regained the stature by which it was known in the centuries of its most far-reaching influence. The question now is how it will relate to the contemporary search for world order, particularly in its relations with the United States. The United States and China are both indispensable pillars of world order. Remarkably, both have historically exhibited an ambivalent attitude toward the international system they now anchor, affirming their commitment to it even as they reserve judgment on aspects of its design. China has no precedent for the role it is asked to play in 21st century order, as one major state among others. Nor does the United States have experience interacting on a sustained basis with a country of comparable size, reach, and economic performance embracing a distinctly different model of domestic order. The cultural and political backgrounds of the two sides diverge in important aspects. The American approach to policy is pragmatic, China's is conceptual. America has never had a powerful threatening neighbor, China has never been without a powerful adversary on its borders. Americans hold that every problem has a solution, Chinese think that each solution is an admission ticket to a new set of problems. Americans seek an outcome responding to immediate circumstances, Chinese concentrate on evolutionary change. Americans outline an agenda of practical, deliverable items. Chinese set out general principles and analyze where they will lead. Chinese thinking is shaped in part by communism but embraces a traditionally Chinese way of thought to an increasing extent. Neither is intuitively familiar to Americans. China and the United States have, in their histories, only recently fully participated in an international system of sovereign states. China has believed that it was unique and largely contained within its own reality. America also considers itself unique, that is, exceptional, but with a moral obligation to support its values around the world for reasons beyond raison d'etat. Two great societies of different cultures and different premises are both undergoing fundamental domestic adjustments. Whether this translates into rivalry or into a new form of partnership will importantly shape prospects for 21st century world order. China is now governed by the fifth generation of leaders since the revolution. Each previous leader distilled his generation's particular vision of China's needs. Mao Zedong was determined to uproot established institutions, even those he had built in the original phase of his victory, lest they stagnate under China's bureaucratic propensities. Deng Xiaoping understood that China could not maintain its historic role unless it became internationally engaged. Deng's style was sharply focused, not to boast, lest foreign countries become disquieted, not to claim to lead but to extend China's influence by modernizing both the society and the economy. On that basis, starting in 1989, Jiang Zemin, appointed during the Tiananmen Square crisis, overcame its aftermath with his personal diplomacy internationally and by broadening the base of the Communist Party domestically. He led the PRC into the international state and trading system as a full member. Hu Jintao, selected by Deng, skillfully assuaged concerns about China's growing power and laid the basis for the concept of the new type of major power relationship, enunciated by Xi Jinping. The Xi Jinping leadership has sought to build on these legacies by undertaking a massive reform program of the Deng scale. It has projected a system that, while eschewing democracy, would be made more transparent and in which outcomes would be determined more by legal procedures than by the established pattern of personal and family relationships. It has announced challenges to many established institutions and practices, state-run enterprises, fiefdoms of regional officials, and large-scale corruption, in a manner that combines vision with courage but is certain to bring in its train a period of flux and some uncertainty. The composition of the Chinese leadership reflects China's evolution toward participating in, and even shaping, global affairs. In 1982, not a single member of the Politburo had a college degree. At this writing, almost all of them are college-educated, and a significant number have advanced degrees. A college degree in China is based on a Western-style curriculum, not a legacy of the old Mandarin system, or the subsequent Communist Party curriculum, which imposed its own form of intellectual inbreeding. This represents a sharp break with China's past, when the Chinese were intensely and proudly parochial in their perception of the world outside their immediate sphere. Contemporary Chinese leaders are influenced by their knowledge of China's history but are not captured by it. World Order. Henry Kissinger. Reflections on the Character of Nations and the Course of History. Chapter 4. The United States and Iran, Approaches to Order. 1. The Tradition of Iranian Statecraft. 2. The Khomeini Revolution. 3. Nuclear proliferation and Iran. 4. Vision and Reality. Chapter 4. The United States and Iran, Approaches to Order. In the spring of 2013, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, The figure then and now outranking all Iranian government ministers, including Iran's president and foreign minister, delivered a speech to an international conference of Muslim clerics, lauding the onset of a new global revolution. What elsewhere was called the Arab Spring, he declared, was in fact an Islamic awakening of world-spanning consequence. The West erred in assessing that the crowds of demonstrators represented the triumph of liberal democracy, Khomeini explained. The demonstrators would reject the bitter and horrifying experience of following the West in politics, behavior and lifestyle, because they embodied the miraculous fulfillment of divine promises. Today, what lies in front of our eyes and cannot be denied by any informed and intelligent individual is that the world of Islam has now emerged out of the sidelines of social and political equations of the world, that it has found a prominent and outstanding position at the center of decisive global events, and that it offers a fresh outlook on life, politics, government, and social developments. In Khomeini's analysis, this reawakening of Islamic consciousness was opening the door to a global religious revolution that would finally vanquish the overbearing influence of the United States and its allies and bring an end to 3 centuries of Western primacy. Islamic awakening, which speakers in the arrogant and reactionary camp do not even dare to mention in words, is a truth whose signs can be witnessed in almost all parts of the world of Islam. The most obvious sign of it is the enthusiasm of public opinion, especially among young people, to revive the glory and greatness of Islam, to become aware of the nature of the international order of domination and to remove the mask from the shameless, oppressive and arrogant face of the governments and centers that have been pressuring the Islamic and non-Islamic East. Following the failure of communism and liberalism, and with the power and confidence of the West crumbling, the Islamic awakening would reverberate across the world, Khomeini pledged, unifying the global Muslim Ummah, the transnational community of believers, and restoring it to world centrality. This final goal cannot be anything less than creating a brilliant Islamic civilization. All parts of the Islamic Ummah, in the form of different nations and countries, should achieve the civilizational position that has been specified in the Holy Quran. Through religious faith, knowledge, ethics, and constant struggle, Islamic civilization can gift advanced thought and noble codes of behavior to the Islamic Ummah and to the entire humanity, and it can be the point of liberation from materialistic and oppressive outlooks and corrupt codes of behavior that form the pillars of current Western civilization. Khomeini had expatiated upon this topic previously. As he remarked to an audience of Iranian paramilitary forces in 2011, popular protests in the West spoke to a global hunger for spirituality and legitimacy as exemplified by Iran's theocracy. A world revolution awaited. The developments in the US and Europe suggest a massive change that the world will witness in the future. Today, the slogans of Egyptians and the Tunisians are being repeated in New York and California. The Islamic Republic is currently the focal point of the awakening movement of nations, and this reality is what has upset the enemies. In any other region, such declarations would have been treated as a major revolutionary challenge. A theocratic figure wielding supreme spiritual and temporal power was, in a significant country, publicly embracing a project of constructing an alternative world order in opposition to the one being practiced by the world community. The supreme leader of contemporary Iran was declaring that universal religious principles, not national interests or liberal internationalism, would dominate the new world he prophesied. Had such sentiments been voiced by an Asian or a European leader, they would have been interpreted as a shocking global challenge. Yet 35 years of repetition had all but inured the world to the radicalism of these sentiments and the actions backing them. On its part, Iran combined its challenge to modernity with a millennial tradition of a statecraft of exceptional subtlety. A longer perspective. Potential tensions between an established and a rising power are not new. Inevitably, the rising power impinges on some spheres heretofore treated as the exclusive preserve of the established power. By the same token, the rising power suspects that its rival may seek to quash its growth before it is too late. A Harvard study has shown that in 15 cases in history where a rising and an established power interacted, 10 ended in war. It is therefore not surprising that significant strategic thinkers on both sides invoke patterns of behavior and historical experience to predict the inevitability of conflict between the two societies. On the Chinese side, many American actions are interpreted as a design to thwart China's rise, and the American promotion of human rights is seen as a project to undermine China's domestic political structure. Some major figures describe America's so-called pivot policy as the forerunner of an ultimate showdown designed to keep China permanently in a secondary position, an attitude all the more remarkable because it has not involved any significant military redeployments at this writing. On the American side, the fear is that a growing China will systematically undermine American preeminence and thus American security. Significant groups view China, by analogy to the Soviet Union in the Cold War, as determined to achieve military as well as economic dominance in all surrounding regions and hence, ultimately, hegemony. Both sides are reinforced in their suspicions by the military maneuvers and defense programs of the other. Even when they are normal, that is, composed of measures a country would reasonably take in defense of national interest as it is generally understood, they are interpreted in terms of worst-case scenarios. Each side has a responsibility for taking care lest its unilateral deployments and conduct escalate into an arms race. The two sides need to absorb the history of the decade before World War I, when the gradual emergence of an atmosphere of suspicion and latent confrontation escalated into catastrophe. The leaders of Europe trapped themselves by their military planning and inability to separate the tactical from the strategic. Two other issues are contributing to tension in Sino-American relations. China rejects the proposition that international order is fostered by the spread of liberal democracy, and that the international community has an obligation to bring this about, and especially to achieve its perception of human rights by international action. The United States may be able to adjust the application of its views on human rights in relation to strategic priorities. But in light of its history and the convictions of its people, America can never abandon these principles altogether. On the Chinese side, the dominant elite view on this subject was expressed by Deng Xiaoping. Actually, national sovereignty is far more important than human rights, but the group of 7, or 8, often infringe upon the sovereignty of poor, weak countries of the Third World. Their talk about human rights, freedom and democracy is designed only to safeguard the interests of the strong, rich countries, which take advantage of their strength to bully weak countries, and which pursue hegemony and practice power politics. No formal compromise is possible between these views. To keep the disagreement from spiraling into conflict is one of the principal obligations of the leaders of both sides. A more immediate issue concerns North Korea, to which Bismarck's 19th-century aphorism surely applies. We live in a wondrous time, in which the strong is weak because of his scruples and the weak grows strong because of his audacity. North Korea is ruled under no accepted principle of legitimacy, not even its claimed communist one. Its principal achievement has been to build a few nuclear devices. It has no military capability to engage in war with the United States. But the existence of these weapons has a political impact far exceeding their military utility. They provide an incentive for Japan and South Korea to create a nuclear military capability. They embolden Pyongyang into risk-taking disproportionate to its capabilities, raising the danger of another war on the Korean peninsula. For China, North Korea embodies complex legacies. In many Chinese eyes, the Korean War is seen as a symbol of China's determination to end its century of humiliation and stand up on the world stage, but also as a warning against becoming involved in wars whose origins China does not control, and whose repercussions may have serious long-range, unintended consequences. This is why China and the United States have taken parallel positions in the UN Security Council in demanding that North Korea abandon, not curtail, its nuclear program. For the Pyongyang regime, abandoning nuclear weapons may well involve political disintegration. But abandonment is precisely what the United States and China have publicly demanded in the UN resolutions that they have fostered. The two countries need to coordinate their policies for the contingency that their stated objectives are realized. Will it be possible to merge the concerns and goals of the two sides over Korea? Are China and the United States able to work out a collaborative strategy for a denuclearized, unified Korea that leaves all parties more secure and more free? It would be a big step toward the new type of great power relations, so often invoked and so slow in emerging. China's new leaders will recognize that the reaction of the Chinese population to their vast agenda cannot be known. They are sailing into uncharted waters. They cannot want to seek foreign adventures, but they will resist intrusions on what they define as their core interests with perhaps greater insistence than their predecessors, precisely because they feel obliged to explain the adjustments inseparable from reform by a reinforced emphasis on the national interest. Any international order comprising both the United States and China must involve a balance of power, but the traditional management of the balance needs to be mitigated by agreement on norms and reinforced by elements of cooperation. The leaders of China and the United States have publicly recognized the two countries' common interest in charting a constructive outcome. Two American presidents, Barack Obama and George W. Bush, have agreed with their Chinese counterparts, Xi Jinping and Hu Jintao, to create a strategic partnership in the Pacific region, which is a way to preserve a balance of power while reducing the military threat inherent in it. So far, the proclamations of intent have not been matched by specific steps in the agreed direction. Partnership cannot be achieved by proclamation. No agreement can guarantee a specific international status for the United States. If the United States comes to be perceived as a declining power, a matter of choice, not destiny, China and other countries will succeed to much of the world leadership that America exercised for most of the period following World War II, after an interlude of turmoil and upheaval. Many Chinese may see the United States as a superpower past its peak. Yet among China's leadership, there is also a demonstrated recognition that the United States will sustain a significant leadership capacity for the foreseeable future. The essence of building a constructive world order is that no single country, neither China nor the United States, is in a position to fill by itself the world leadership role of the sort that the United States occupied in the immediate post-Cold War period, when it was materially and psychologically preeminent. In East Asia, the United States is not so much a balancer as an integral part of the balance. Previous chapters have shown the precariousness of the balance when the number of players is small and a shift of allegiance can become decisive. A purely military approach to the East Asian balance is likely to lead to alignments even more rigid than those that produced World War I. In East Asia, Something approaching a balance of power exists between China, Korea, Japan, and the United States, with Russia and Vietnam peripheral participants. But it differs from the historical balances of power in that one of the key participants, the United States, has its center of gravity located far from the geographic center of East Asia, and, above all, because the leaders of both countries whose military forces conceive themselves as adversaries in their military journals and pronouncements, also proclaim partnership as a goal on political and economic issues. So it comes about that the United States is an ally of Japan and a proclaimed partner of China, a situation comparable to Bismarck's when he made an alliance with Austria balanced by a treaty with Russia. Paradoxically, it was precisely that ambiguity which preserved the flexibility of the European equilibrium. And its abandonment, in the name of transparency, started a sequence of increasing confrontations, culminating in World War I. For over a century, since the open-door policy and Theodore Roosevelt's mediation of the Russo-Japanese War, it has been a fixed American policy to prevent hegemony in Asia. Under contemporary conditions, it is an inevitable policy in China to keep potentially adversarial forces as far from its borders as possible. The two countries navigate in that space. The preservation of peace depends on the restraint with which they pursue their objectives, and on their ability to ensure that competition remains political and diplomatic. In the Cold War, the dividing lines were defined by military forces. In the contemporary period, the lines should not be defined primarily by military deployment. The military component should not be conceived as the only, or even the principal, definition of the equilibrium. Concepts of partnership need to become, paradoxically, elements of the modern balance of power, especially in Asia, an approach that, if implemented as an overarching principle, would be as unprecedented as it is important. The combination of balance of power strategy with partnership diplomacy will not be able to remove all adversarial aspects, but it can mitigate their impact. Above all, it can give Chinese and American leaders experiences in constructive cooperation, and convey to their two societies a way of building toward a more peaceful future. Order always requires a subtle balance of restraint, force, and legitimacy. In Asia, it must combine a balance of power with a concept of partnership. A purely military definition of the balance will shade into confrontation. A purely psychological approach to partnership will raise fears of hegemony. Wise statesmanship must try to find that balance. For outside it, disaster beckons.